Welcome, friends. And I am really excited to have Sam Labrier back on yet again. Some of my favorite Rising Tide Foundation lectures were delivered by Sam, whose work on history, his understanding of the American system, which is continuing to improve day to day. This is a very complex idea. There's a simple set of principles which everybody can get relatively easily. But if you really want to like grow those roots of knowledge deep, it requires some heavy lifting and appreciation for nuance and the textures of the clash between the counterfeit idea of political science, of science more generally, of civilization, expressed by the British system in its most recent incarnation in world history. But that goes back to ancient times as a very sick way of thinking about the nature of human beings, God, the creator, the purpose of why we are, versus a much more healthy natural law orientation, which has always arisen in a beautiful manner in opposition to the toxicity of lies. And this battle of the American system, of the rise of the American experiment of the Republic, and the continuing battle lines that are today shaping world history can only be understood if people do the work as Sam has done. And so I appreciate that Sam pitched me an idea of something that he's been working on for some time, which is the battle over the greenback. And why did Lincoln's system, how did it emerge? What was it up against as something more than simply the customary discussion around, there's all sorts of simplistic reasons given about the Civil War and the aftermath. But really, what was this? How did the American system express itself under Lincoln, under his advisors like Henry C. Carey? Why didn't it continue on and grow in power and influence in the decades after the Civil War? What caused it? Did it fail under its own fallacies, or was there a battle to sabotage this otherwise very natural system, which was spreading across the world with great hope that humanity might finally be able to tap into something much more pure to liberate ourselves of this ancient system of evil? So Sam will deliver part one of what is at least going to be a two-part, maybe three-part series over the coming weeks and months ahead. But today's going to be a really good fresh start. So Sam, like usual, I'm going to throw the ball in your court for your main presentation. And when you're all done that, I expect that people will want to throw some questions at you, and we'll just open up for dialogue when you're all finished. 5 o'clock is like the last, so we have 3 hours max today to do this, just so y'all know there's a little certain boundary condition, but I think we can get a lot done in 3 hours anyway. So Sam, it's all yours.
Yeah, we should absolutely have no problem with that. Thank you very much, Matt, for the opportunity. As usual, you sort of gave me the kick in the ass that I needed on a topic that I was thinking about starting a research project on for a while, and you know, asking if there was anything I would like to present on sort of got me to say, yeah, I do have this topic. And I would like to do a presentation on it and really get the ball rolling on this research, which I've wanted to do for a while. So it's great to see everybody. Thank you for being here. It's kind of a cold, dreary, rainy day here, but I got my hot cup of green matcha in honor of the topic, which will be the greenbacks. And I'll just share my screen and we can get started. So I think it's this one. And so you should see my presentation and can get going. So the attack on the greenback, part one. And I've always been a fan of Henry Carey, and that's how this whole project got started, was wanting to research Henry Carey's role in the whole process of trying to defend the greenback after the death of Lincoln. And so that's where I started from. But some people, they might be asking, why even study the greenback at all? What's the point? So the way that I see it, my contention is that the powers of the oligarchy, which they don't have a country, they sit above nations. And the the source of that power is their private control of the money supply. And so the only way to overcome that oligarchy is to take away that power. Right now in Canada, we have two types of money: government created money, the bills that are in your wallet, and bank created money. A lot of people think when you go to the bank and get a mortgage and they give you however many, hundreds of thousands for your house, that money exists in the bank vault somewhere, but that's actually not true. The bank actually creates that money basically out of thin air, and it's called bank created money. According to Bank of Canada's own statistics, bank created money accounts for roughly 96% of the money supply in Canada. So we have a monetary system where the vast majority of the money that's in circulation is created by relatively few incredibly wealthy people. As we know, in Canada, we don't have that many banks, the big six and a couple other smaller ones. And so this very tiny oligarchy in Canada controls the vast majority of our money supply in Canada. And in the US, it's fairly similar. Bank created money is roughly 90% of the US money supply, because there is a great deal more US dollars that are held overseas by other countries due to the fact that the US is the world reserve currency, at least for now. Who knows how long that's going to last given the current situation of things, but at least for now, and it has been for quite some time. So as I said, it started with Henry C. Carey, the son of Matthew Carey, who himself was a prodigy of Ben Franklin. So there's kind of a direct line from Ben Franklin to Henry Carey. And here's just a brief list of Henry Carey's works that he began. If you notice, The Way to Outdo England Without Fighting Her in 1865, and you start to see this torrent of writings that starts to come out in the 1865-1866 period on the question of money, the greenback, gold standard, specie resumption, contraction of the greenback supply. These are words that recur in his writings again and again. He wrote in this period over 1,000 pages in pamphlets and open letters, arguing that the greenback system should be maintained. And in the course of this investigation, I have started to become aware of a lot of other people besides Henry Carey that were deeply involved in this fight on both sides, the gold bugs and the greenbackers. And so I'm going to give a little introduction to the early greenback period itself. And I found this in a biography of Thaddeus Stevens, The Life of Thaddeus Stevens, which gives a really good overview of how the greenback came to be. So in the book, it says that the banks could not sell the government securities on a declining public credit, which they held in large quantities, except at a sacrifice. The public not only failed to deposit its coin in the banks, but they began a positive and alarming withdrawal of deposits, and the specie reserve in the banks dwindled at a rate of nearly $1 million a day. This was after the outbreak of the war late in 1861. It was all outgo and no income. The inevitable result followed, an event of prime importance in the financial history of the war, namely the suspension of specie payments by the banks on December 30th, 1861. The government, too, as a matter of course, suspended coin payments. The financial prop had given way, and by January 1st, 1862, the fiscal system established between the Treasury and the banks had collapsed, and Secretary Chase who was the Treasury Secretary, was at a loss of what to do or what direction to turn in the crisis. It is doubtful if any minister of finance ever faced a graver dilemma. Thaddeus Stevens favored the latter alternative, the abandonment of gold and the abandonment of a paper currency issued by banks that had already shown their inability to redeem their paper promises at their value of gold. This is an important point. Even under the gold standard, you still have an inflationary paper currency, which is the gold certificate. Because banks don't loan out on a one-to-one ratio, we have a fractional reserve system. And so even with the gold standard, you still get this inflated paper currency. But the issue is that it's supposed to be backed by gold. And then during these bank runs, the whole system collapses because of the fractional nature of it, which is not a weakness of a purely paper system. There is, of course, weaknesses in overprinting of money, which we saw under COVID, and we have issues with that as well. But you do not have that issue with a purely paper currency. He stood for the establishment of a uniform nationwide paper currency for all, a currency issued directly by the United States government without the mediation of banks. This currency would do the work of money for the people. It would not be a commodity of foreign commerce, like gold, nor an article of export. It was to be interchangeable with 6% United States bonds based upon the good faith and property of the whole people. If the bonds were safe, the notes would be safe. He believed that this would give the country a safe, ample, uniform national currency for all the trade and business of the country and prove an effective means in promoting the sale of government bonds. And thus every note holder and every bond holder, as creditors of the government, would be directly interested in maintaining the national unity, prosperity, honor, and good faith, while the interests of the people would prove a guarantee against excessive and dangerous issues of currency. It is pertinent to observe that those who are constantly crying out from fear of an overissue of such notes never seem to have any fear of an overissue of interest-bearing bonds. When the plan of the committee to issue legal tender notes was made known to the country, bankers who were opposed to the measure came to Washington and endeavored to persuade the secretary and committee that there was a better remedy for the situation of the Treasury than the issue of government paper money. They proposed through their spokesman, Mr. James Gallatin, president of the Gallatin Bank of New York, the sale of long-time bonds at the market price, accompanied with heavy taxation. Gallatin's plan also involved the retirement of the demand notes. Those were the first greenback notes. The issue of $100 million of interest-bearing treasury notes, and the suspension of the Sub-Treasury Act so as to permit the banks to become the depositories of the government funds. It was to let the government take care of the banks. The banks could take care of the currency and the money of the people. The government should then go into the market and borrow this money as best it could through the banks. There are those who call this patriotic effort of the masters of finance to aid the government in its emergency. But there are others so obtuse as still to believe the bankers' plan was primarily in their own interests, meaning in the interests of the people. The bankers had the interests of the people in mind in doing this. By this plan, the state banks were to be made the sole agents of the government throughout the crisis. Their irredeemable notes, even after the suspension of specie payments, were to be received by the government for loans. Notes whose gold basis had just been proved a fiction or a figment of the imagination. These local banks, more than 1,500 in number, were to continue to usurp the important franchise of supplying the circulating medium of the country, a medium to be used as the money of commerce without any guarantee whatever of its uniformity or stability. The essential national power of controlling the currency was to be left to these state agencies. To the national government, not to the banks nor the states, had been given the power to coin money and to regulate its value. That was an exclusive national power. The state was not to issue money or to authorize its issue. He quickly disposed of the constitutional argument that the power to issue legal tender notes was nowhere expressly granted to Congress. And here he echoes Alexander Hamilton. Few acts which government can perform are specified in that instrument. It would require a volume larger than the Pandex of Justinian or the Code Napoleon to make such enumeration. Everything necessary to carry out the granted powers is clearly implied. If nothing could be done by Congress except what is enumerated, the government could not live a week. He thought little of the argument based on the intention of the Convention of 1787. The right to emit bills of credit, which the Convention expressly refused to grant, has for 50 years, by the common consent of the nation, been practiced and is now conceded by every opponent of this bill. With what grace can the concomitant power to make them a legal tender be objected to? The Supreme Court has settled the principle upon which this bill is based, that when anything is necessary to carry into effect the granted power, it is constitutional. Stevens here stood upon the constitutional ground occupied by Hamilton in the infancy of the Union in his fundamental doctrine of implied powers, by which Hamilton laid the cornerstone for the powers of the federal government. In his famous opinion furnished to Washington in advocating the validity of the first United States Bank, Hamilton laid down the principle that was afterward affirmed by Chief Justice Marshall in the famous case of McCulloch versus Maryland. This principle was now drawn into use by Stevens. He stood upon the impregnable ground that if any law is necessary and proper to carry into execution any delegated power, such law is valid. The test of constitutionality was in the end sought. The discretion of Congress was absolute and sovereign as to the means to be employed. Stevens held, as Hamilton did, that the necessity need not be absolute, inevitable, and overwhelming. If it be useful, expedient, profitable, the necessity is within the constitutional meaning, and whether such necessity exists is solely for the decision of Congress. If Congress should decide this measure to be necessary to a granted power, no department of the government can rejudge it. The Supreme Court might think the judgment of Congress erroneous, but they could not review it. This view, which Stevens was then advocating and reasserting, has now passed into history with the sanction of the Supreme Court itself and with the general acceptance of the nation. And it will be a final judgment of history on the legal tender legislation of that day. As an aside, later on, the Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court later on, and he rules that his own Greenback notes were unconstitutional. And then that decision was then overturned by the Supreme Court. I think it was 3 years after that. So that's what they're saying, that has now passed into history with the sanction of the Supreme Court. It should be remembered that the notes that Stevens proposed were not the notes that were issued. The notes that he favored were the notes of the greenbacker, full legal tender money, limited in amount, and convertible into interest-bearing bonds. So this is an important distinction. This fight over the greenbacks themselves early on that a lot of people aren't aware of. The difference between Stevens and the later greenbacker was that he looked upon these notes, as all their promoters did at the time, as a temporary expedient. And he expected the bonds which they might be used to buy not to be continually exchangeable for greenbacks at the option of the holder, but to be paid in gold at the end of 20 years if they had not been redeemed in lawful money before that time. That is, in the same notes the purchaser should use in buying the bonds, United States notes, lawful money for all alike, based on an ultimate gold security, since Stevens expected to return to specie payments. Remember, this is 1862. He thought to be necessary and proper, the best that could be devised in the hour of uncertainty and distress. He was not much in sympathy with the unfortunate moneylenders who were clamorous lest the debtor should be the more easily pay his debt. He met with his usual sneer. He was rich in sneers, the counter proposals before the House. Roscoe Conkling's proposal to issue 7% bonds payable in 31 years to be sold for the currency of the banks of Boston, New York, or Philadelphia seemed to Stevens to lack every element of wise legislation. The bill passed the House as Stevens favored it, with no exception clause. The notes were to be a legal tender for all debts, public and private. The discriminating exceptions were imposed by the Senate. When the bill came back to the House, it contained, among other amendments, two provisions that were calculated to defeat the chief objects of the bill. So I won't get into the first one, but the other Senate provision was still more objectionable, namely that the interest on the bonds should be paid in coin, and that in order to secure the coin, the Secretary of the Treasury should go into the market and sell his bonds for what they would bring. The bill was thus weighted down with the proposed absurdity of two inconsistent and conflicting currencies. One money for ordinary commercial transactions among the people, with the preposterous provision that the government dues to a particular class should be paid in another and wholly different legal tender. This was gold, the want of which had made the Treasury notes necessary, and which must yet be purchased at any sacrifice. So after all, the Treasury was not to escape from its shackles, but must be forced to hawk its bonds to the gold brokers in Wall Street for gold. And the plan for a new national currency was to be brought to naught. Within a few months, the financiers who were responsible for these Senate amendments began to complain of the evils arising from the disparity between specie and greenback notes. And with an assumption of superior virtue and wisdom, they attributed all these evils to the legal tender legislation. On the other hand, the greenbackers attributed those evils to the legislation promoted by the advocates of specie that made one currency for the government and another for the people, the amendment that bound the government to pay its bond interest in gold. It was exactly this that Stevens and his coadjutors sought to avoid. There should be one currency for all sections and classes alike, and not one kind of money for the poor and another for the rich, or one kind for the debtor and another for the creditor. Consequently, when the bill came back from the Senate with these obstructing and discriminating clauses, Stevens was ready to abandon the whole legal tender feature of the bill rather than accept the pernicious amendments. He denounced the amended measure as an incongruous monster, as a bill with many uncouth features. And no wonder, for it had a vast number of progenitors and must partake in the lineaments of all. The original bill had been hailed with delight throughout the country. Congratulations had come in from all classes of people, merchants, traders, manufacturers, mechanics, laborers, and from the boards of trade of the principal cities. Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts said in the Senate that not 1,000 people in his state opposed the legal tender clause, that 99 in 100 of the loyal people favored it, that the sentiment of the nation approaches unanimity in its favor. He had letters from several large commercial houses representing millions of capital, and they say they do not know a merchant in the city of Boston engaged in active business who is not for this legal tender. And this is an issue that'll come up later for the gold bugs, that the greenback was enormously popular in the country with massive swath of the population. It is true, said Stevens, a doleful sound came up from the caverns of bullion brokers and from the saloons of the associated banks. Their cashiers and agents were soon on the ground and persuaded the Senate with but little deliberation to mangle and destroy what it had cost the House months to digest, consider, and pass. They fell upon the bill in hot haste and so disfigured and deformed it that its very father would not know it. Instead of being a beneficent and invigorating measure, it is now positively mischievous. It has all the bad qualities that its enemies charged on the original bill and none of its benefits. It now creates money and by its very terms declares it a depreciated currency. It makes two classes of money, one for the banks and brokers and another for the people. It discriminates between the rights of different classes of creditors, allowing the rich capitalist to demand gold and compelling the ordinary lender of money to receive notes which the government had purposely discredited. He disclaimed responsibility for the result of the bill, and he looked upon its passage in its amended form as deplorable and permanently injurious to all classes of the community except the class that he had accepted, bankers, bond buyers, and bullionists. The House agreed to the Senate amendment providing for the payment of bond interest in coin, but it disagreed to some other amendments, and the result was a conference committee between the two houses. Messrs. Fessenden, Sherman, and Carlisle represented the Senate, and Stevens, Sedgwick, and Horton represented the House. And after some days of discussion, the outcome was an agreement to resort to customs dues instead of bond sales as a means of securing the coin for interest payment. So, in sticking with their tariff policy, they then said, okay, well, for the tariffs and the customs dues, we'll make the foreign merchants give us gold to pay the tariffs, and we'll use that gold for securing the coin that we need for these interest payments. So then the bill passed. It provided for the issue of $150 million of legal tender treasury notes with the exception clauses, stipulating that customs dues and the government's interest payments should be in coin, that these notes might be exchanged for bonds at 6% or deposited on interest at 5%, and the issue of $500 million of 520 bonds was authorized. In a later financial discussion in the House, on February 28, 1865, Stevens later said, to this unwise discrimination, creating two kinds of currency and pronouncing one kind of lawful money inferior to the other kind of lawful money, I attribute most of the trouble which has arisen from the high price of everything, the enormous and unnecessary expense of the war, and the constant fluctuation in the market. So that's a good overview of how the greenback came to be and some of the nuances behind its early creation that many people are not aware of. And I'll just go through some basic history of the greenback, the timeline of paper currency within this period. The first notes were emergency notes that were issued by an act of Congress in 1861. These were the first greenbacks. They were called that because the back of them, you can see, is printed in green ink. And this is the $5 bill with a picture of Alexander Hamilton on it. These were in circulation until this period that we just read about in the biography of Stevens, 1862. They pass the bill allowing for what became known as United States notes, which replaced those earlier demand notes. They also had these 730 notes, which were issued from 1861 to 1865. These gave 7.3% interest. So the $50 note would generate 1 cent of interest every day. A $100 note would give 2 cents of interest every day. So it was fairly easy math for people to calculate how much their note had earned them based on how many days it had been issued. These were the United States notes. The one on top is the first demand note, and you can see a couple of differences. At the bottom of the demand note on top, it says receivable in payment of all public dues, whereas that is later missing from the United States note. As we said, the dues to the customs were not payable in these notes. Those had to be paid in gold as part of the deal. And these actually circulated for over 100 years until 1971 in America. They also had what they called postage currency for very small amounts because um, for like change and things like that, they didn't have the system of like pennies and nickels and dimes that we are used to, and they had these small amounts generated, and it was receivable for postage stamps at the post office, which is federal, right? So it was good throughout the whole country. But they were often used by people, passed around as currency as well. They had these issue bearing notes as well, which were issued later. Um, these were not issued for long, just 1863 to 1864. And they had a table on the back showing the $20 note, for example, how much interest it would generate 6 months, 1 year, 18 months, 2 years. And then finally, we got the national banknotes, which replaced the the earlier issuance of the U.S. notes. Although the U.S. notes continued to be issued as well by the federal government, the national banks issued these notes, and the way that it worked was they would buy U.S. bonds, and then they could issue these bills against the bonds that the banks bought from the government. And this was all regulated by the national banking system that was brought in later on in the Lincoln administration by the comptroller of the currency, and so on. And they also had these gold certificates, which they were mainly for bankers to use. So the bankers, actually, the big advocates of the gold standard, they found gold to be extremely unwieldy to deal with, bringing these big, heavy gold, um, you know, wheelbarrows, I guess. They had, a lot of money that had to be cleared back and forth all the time in gold. And the United States government liked the idea. Actually, Thaddeus Stevens was instrumental in setting this up. So it was kind of a marriage of convenience because the US government was able to subvert the London and New York gold rooms by doing this, by setting up their own store of gold. And the New York bankers, especially, were in favor of it as well because they were worried about being robbed. They were still worried about the war if, the Confederates invaded and took over their gold house. So they were happy to have this US government takeover of the gold storage. And you could store your gold with the US government and then receive these certificates saying that this amount of gold is stored by the US government, and you can come redeem this certificate for the gold at any time. So the first one I want to look at from Henry Carey is typically called The Way to Outdo England Without Fighting Her. These were letters that he wrote to Schuyler Colfax, who was a Speaker of the House at the time. And if you note the dates on these, he wrote these letters very early in 1865. So Lincoln was still alive. But already you can see the clamor in the country. It was obvious that the war was coming to an end, that the North was going to win. The South was defeated. It was dragging on, but it was obvious. And so in late 1864, it already became evident that there was going to be a war against the greenback by the gold bugs. And so Henry Carey already jumps into action before Lincoln is even killed. And in these letters, he talks on paper, iron, the farmer, the railroad, and last on the currency question. So we'll just look at what he wrote in the section on the currency question. So he wrote to Schuyler Colfax. Schuyler Colfax, by the way, named Schuyler Colfax because his grandfather married into the Schuyler family, Philip Schuyler, who was Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law. Alexander Hamilton married Eliza Schuyler. So there's a deep tie to from Schuyler Colfax to that Hamiltonian legacy. The rich thus grew richer as the poor grew poorer. Remember, this is early 1865. Why was all this? Why did they not use the gold of which California had already sent us so many hundreds of millions? Because we had most carefully followed in the train of British free trade teachers who had assured our people that the safe, true, and certain road towards wealth and power was to be found in the direction of sending wheat, flour, corn, pork, and wool to England in their rudest form, and then buying them back again at quadruple prices, paying the difference in the products of Californian mines. What is here supposed to have been done is almost precisely what has been done by Mr. Lincoln and his administration. We have been enabled to lend or pay to the government thousands of millions of dollars, where before, under the system which made us wholly dependent on the mercy of the most wealthy capitalists of England, we found it difficult to furnish even tens of millions. The whole history of the world presents no case of a financial success so perfect. Further than all of this, we have for the first time acquired something approaching to a national independence. In all time past, the price of money having been wholly dependent on the price in England, the most important intelligence from beyond the Atlantic was that which was to be found in the price of British securities on the Exchange of London. In all this, there has been a change so complete that the price of British consols has ceased entirely to enter into American calculations. The stride in this respect alone that has been made in the direction of independence is worth to the country more than the whole money cost of the great war in which we are now engaged. I think this is one of the most important ideas of this whole research project that I'm doing when I found this quote from Henry Carey. This is what was lost, this stride in the direction of independence, which was worth to the country more than the whole money cost of the Great War. That is what was lost by returning to the gold standard, which was controlled by London and their agents on Wall Street. But primarily the center of control of the gold trade in the world was London. So they were returning their money supply to British control in doing this. The danger of dependence upon the British money market, always great, has now been much increased, and it must become greater with every year, so long as British banking operations shall continue to be governed by that wonderfully absurd system for which the British people stand today indebted to the financial ignorance of Sir Robert Peel. Great and obvious as have been the benefits derived by the country from the system inaugurated under the administration of Mr. Lincoln, they are, as we are assured, counterbalanced by their tendency to produce inflation and thus to increase the price of gold. How little truth there is in this, I propose to show in another letter. So this was like a series of letters to Schuyler Colfax. So he's saying, I'm going to end this letter here, and in the next letter, I'm going to get into this. So now, in a new letter, he's saying, to what do we owe these wonderful results of a state of civil war? To rapidity of the societary circulation and to nothing else. And what he's saying here, these wonderful results of a state of civil war, is he's saying that at least the wonderful results are that we now have a growing economy. We're building factories, we're building furnaces for steel production. The the agricultural output is way up. And so that's what he's saying are these wonderful results of the Civil War. And what do we owe it to? The rapidity of the societary circulation. That's the Greenbacks. To what have we been indebted to for that rapidity, to protection and the greenbacks? What is it we are now laboring to destroy? Protection and the greenback. Let us continue on in the direction in which we now are moving, and we shall ere long see not resumption, but repudiation, not contradiction, but a confirmation of the predictions of the times, not a reestablishment of the Union, but a complete and final disruption of it. That the currency has been and is inflated is beyond a question. Whence, however, has come the inflation? What has caused the existence of disease? Such are the questions to which an answer must be obtained before we undertake to prescribe the remedy to be adopted. Failing to do this, we will certainly kill the patient. It is constantly assumed that it is the banks that determine how many notes shall be in use. And yet the experience of each and every individual in the community proves that exactly the reverse of this is true. That you, my dear sir, may satisfy yourself of this, I pray you to look for a moment to your own constant action in regard to the question now before us. On a given day, you receive a quantity of banknotes, which are then in circulation. What do you do then with them? You place them in a bank and thus put them out of circulation. On the following day, you perhaps take them from the bank and pay them out, thus putting them again in circulation. What control did the bank exercise over these several operations? None whatsoever. It's you, your friends, neighbors, and fellow citizens generally that regulate this circulation. And it is just as wise to pass laws limiting its amount as it would be to pass other laws determining the quantity of coal, iron, sugar, or coffee to be provided for their use. We are told, however, of the depreciation of continental money, French assignats, and Confederate notes, and are threatened that we shall here experience the same result. Here he's directly attacking Simon Newcomb of the Boston Brahmin class, who we'll see later issued a call to end the greenbacks and return to gold, because Simon Newcomb's three main arguments were continental money, the French assignats, and the Confederate notes. But those who present such views can scarcely properly appreciate the difference between the conditions under which such paper was emitted and those in which we stand. The first was issued by a confederation that was little better than a rope of sand, and that had no certain power to provide for the ultimate payment of either principal or interest of any debt it might contract. The second, the French assignats, were at first receivable only in payment for confiscated property and were of no value for any other purpose. And the last, the Confederate notes, has been issued by an authority the permanent maintenance of which has been so much doubted that few have held its securities longer than was required for enabling them to pass them off to someone else. They have been received by a community that has been cut off from the outer world and whose single source of wealth, slavery, has wholly disappeared. Contrast here, my dear sir, the circumstances above described with those under which our greenbacks have been issued. They have gone out in payment for property purchased of or services rendered by persons who have freely sold the one or rendered the other. The authority by which they have been issued is one quite as capable of binding posterity as was the government of Washington and Adams. They are used by a people whose numbers are constantly growing and whose productive powers are steadily increasing in the ratio which they bear to population. The man who receives them finds himself surrounded by other men who gladly give him houses and lands at prices little greater than those he would have paid 10 years since and before the great free trade crisis of 1857. At the date of the Battle of Gettysburg, say July 3rd, 1863, the legal tender circulation was, as has been shown, $400 million, with gold at $124. So where he says 124, he's saying like parity at the beginning with the greenback being 100. So he's saying now gold is 124. With a present circulation of only 500 million, so increased by 25%, gold is above 200. And yet, as I propose now to show, its amount is very far less in proportion to the space over which it is circulated, to the population to be supplied, and to the work to be done than it was at the date to which I have referred. At that time, we had secure possession of scarcely any portion of the country south of Mason-Dixon line, the Ohio and the Missouri. Today, the federal circulation is needed throughout Maryland, the larger portion of Old Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, Arkansas, much of Mississippi and Louisiana, parts of Georgia, Alabama, and North Carolina, and throughout the whole region bordering on the Mississippi. It is needed too by every emigrant to Minnesota, Nebraska, Colorado, and Nevada. And thus, while we have in the last 18 months added largely to the population to be supplied, we have almost doubled the territory within which that population may be found. Simultaneously with all this, we have added little less than 1/2 to the productive powers of our people and to the transactions for facilitating which a general medium of circulation is required. The power of a bank to make loans is derived from the use of its capital, from its power to furnish circulation, and from its further power to apply to the purchase of securities the money standing to the credit of those with whom it deals, and known by the name of deposits. That it is not to the use of the first we are indebted for the inflation now complained of is very certain. So the bank capital. Variations in the second, its power to furnish circulation, have been only those consequent upon changes otherwise produced has already been shown. So there remains then only the third, the monies, the deposits, meaning the standing to the credit of those with whom it deals, the bank deposits. There remains then only the third, and to that it is now that I propose to call your attention. So he's trying to show that actually the inflation was not so much based upon the paper currency circulation. Let us suppose you yourself to have received on any given day notes or specie amounting to $10, $15, $20, or $50,000, and that while waiting to reinvest them, you have placed them in your safe. Going now on change, you find that sum to be there represented by yourself alone. Let us next suppose that instead of so placing them, you had had them put to your credit in a neighboring bank, and that the bank had forthwith lent them to a dealer in money or in stocks. Going on change under these circumstances, you find your money twice represented. First by yourself, who have it, as you suppose, in the bank, and next by the man who had borrowed it and had had it put to his credit precisely as it had been previously placed to yours. Here is a very simple operation by means of which the amount of deposits has been doubled by the action of the bank itself. And here it is that we find the cause of all the inflation of which we so often had reason to complain, and to which, as I propose to show, we chiefly owe the numerous and extraordinary changes in the price of gold. And here he shows a chart of the circulation and the deposits in the bank and the specie showing from the 1856-1857 crisis, showing that the bank started hoarding specie and the amount of money that got lent out collapsed. And that was the real cause of the crisis right before the war in 1857 under President Buchanan. The facts here exhibited in regards to the circulation are, first, that up to the moment just preceding the explosion, there had been not only been no increase, but an actual reduction in its amount. Second, that that reduction had been consequent upon a closing of workshops and suspension of business otherwise produced. And third, that notwithstanding the almost entire suspension of business, the apparent reduction was but $8 million. Those exhibited in regard to the process of duplication to which your attention has been called are as follows. First, the very small increase that had been required for producing the largest excitement throughout the country at large, the total amount from June 1856 to June 1857, was, as here is shown, but 6 million. And yet there had been thus produced an inflation of the value of property throughout the country to the extent of many hundreds of millions. Second, the very small reduction required for precipitating a whole community into a state of absolute and entire ruin, such as existed at the date of the last returns here given. The whole reduction had been but 41 million, and yet the changes in the value of property thereby produced counted certainly by thousands of millions, so billions of dollars. What caused the rise? The use by banks of the property of others. What caused the fall? The demand of the banks for payment by their debtors. Who suffered? Every man who was in debt. Who profited? Everyone who had the command of money. The rich were thus made richer and the poor made poorer by means of an inflation caused by the action of those very bank managers who in all times past had largely profited of such changes. With all this, as has been shown, the circulation had nothing whatsoever to do, nor could it have, for the reason that that portion of the currency is governed by the people themselves and not in any manner controlled by bank directors. Nevertheless, all our laws are framed as if the circulation were really the portion which needed regulation. And here he's showing a similar table now for the period of the war from the 1861 June to September of 64. And he's trying to show that, again, the amount lent out by the banks vastly increased, and he's going to overlay this to the prices of, and he overlays it here, the price of gold to the greenback in the same date, showing that the bank's issuance of the loans is the real cause of the inflation. The seventh column gives the precise period of the agitation caused by the passage of the gold bill. And from that to the 8th, we have in the price of gold the effect of the extreme depression of the public mind of July and August last. It is by no means to be assumed that the gold variations have been altogether caused by the inflation above exhibited, but that they have to nearly their whole extent been so, the figures above most clearly prove. Were bank loans reduced to the point at which they stood 3 years since, gold would now be as cheap as it was then. The addition thus made to the currency of Pennsylvania can scarcely be estimated at less than $40 million, allowing now for all the rest of the loyal states only twice that sum. We obtain 120 million, which added to that of New York gives us a total of 349 million. Of what does this addition consist? Of precisely the same material that is used for inflating all other balloons. Gas and nothing else. The slightest pinhole causes it to disappear, and therefore it is that we meet with changes in the dimension of the machine. At one moment, as we see, gas is injected and prices of gold, stocks, and commodities generally throughout the country rise, and then the initiated sell. At another, it is compelled to escape, prices then falling, to the great advantage of those who had so lately sold. Most widely different from all this is the action of that portion of the currency furnished by the Treasury and known by the popular name of greenbacks. It goes into the pocket of each individual, there to remain until he can find an opportunity to send it home, or in some other manner to use it for his private benefit. It goes into the pockets of farmers, miners, mechanics, laborers, sailors, traders large and small, enabling each and every one to buy for cash and cheaply what before he could obtain only at the single shop at which he could have credit. It helps to build ships on the Atlantic and the Pacific, on the lakes and on the Mississippi, and it pays the men who sail or work these ships. It enters into every home of the Union and into every old stocking, by help of which the sewing woman is preparing for the purchase of a machine, or the laborer for that of a house. The field of its operation is coextensive with the Union, and its power to affect injuriously the prices of gold, labor, or commodities generally is in the inverse ratio of the extent of that field. Nevertheless, To prevent the possibility of injury from that source, the Treasury has created an acceptable investment coextensive with the greenbacks in amount, by means of which every holder is enabled to convert into an interest-bearing security whatsoever surplus may be in his hands. Having thus provided a perfect escape valve, neither the captain nor the crew need fear explosion. The banker, on the contrary, desires that there may be no valve whatsoever, but that which he himself controls. When it suits him, he injects the gas and continues so to do until he has arrived as near as he dares to go to the point at which explosion may be looked for. Next, he withdraws the gas with equal rapidity and thus produces crises like that of 1857. The men who had taken the lead in measures which had prepared for the explosion proved now to be those most active in forcing liquidation, and thus enabling themselves to purchase at low prices stocks, bonds, and real estate which they had sold at high ones. Aided by the large fortunes thus acquired, men of the same stamp are this day exercising a power thrice greater than was exhibited, the tendency of all their measures being in the direction of making the poor poorer and the rich richer than ever before. Those of the Treasury, meanwhile, looking in a precisely opposite direction and tending to lower the rate of interest while increasing the power over his own actions exercised by the laborer, the miner, the mechanic, and the farmer. The greenback has fallen on the country as the dew falls, bringing with it good to all and doing injury to none. This gas-formed currency, on the contrary, is in the financial world what the water spout is in the natural one. Whirled about by the wind and wholly uncertain in its movements, none can predict of this latter when or where its effects will be most felt, and all around are therefore kept in a state of fever closely resembling that which distinguishes the financial action of the present hour. The deluge comes at last, destroying both property and life, and making a desert where all before had been happiness and peace. It is to restrictions upon the formation of the dew that we are now invited, leaving wholly unchecked the action of those who profit of the desolation caused by the waterspout. The lugubrious predictions of the London Times have thus far not been verified. The war is now, to all appearance, coming rapidly to a close. And not only are we not yet ruined, but there prevails throughout the country a prosperity such as, until recently, had never before been known. To what causes may this properly be attributed? How has it been possible that a community should have furnished so many hundreds of thousands of men and so many thousands of millions of the material of war, without becoming even poorer than before? Let us see. The act of secession by the South was an act of emancipation for the North. Up to that date, the latter had been mere colonies, governed by those wealthy British capitalists. Profiting off of its liberty, the North at once determined on the adoption of measures of protection to the farmer in his efforts for bringing the consumer of his products to take his place in the immediate neighborhood of the place of production, and thus to relieve him from the oppressive tax of transportation imposed upon him by the system above so well described. The effect of this now exhibits itself in the facts that the development of our mineral resources has been great beyond all former example, that diversification in the pursuits of our people now exhibits itself in the naturalization of many of the minor branches of industry in regard to which we had before been wholly dependent upon Europe, that the demand for labor has been so great as to cause large increase of wages, that the high price of labor has caused great increase of immigration, that demand for the farmer's products has so largely increased as to have almost altogether freed him from dependence on the uncertain markets of Europe, that internal commerce has so largely grown as to have doubled in its money value the many hundreds of millions of railroad stock, that the prosperity of existing railroads has caused large increase in the number and extent of roads. That here, for the first time in the history of the world, has been exhibited a community in which every man who had labor to sell could sell it if he would, while every man who had coal, iron, food, or cloth to sell could find at once a person able and willing to buy and pay for it. That for the first time, too, in the history of the world, there has been presented a community in which nearly all business was done for cash, and in which debt had scarcely in existence. That as a necessary consequence of this, there has been a large and general diminution of the rate of interest. That farmers, laborers, miners, and traders have therefore become more independent of the capitalist, while the country at large has become more independent of the wealthy capitalists of Europe. That so great have been the economies of labor and its products, resulting from great rapidity of the societary circulation, that while building more houses and mills, constructing more roads, erecting more machinery, and living better than ever before, our people have been enabled to contribute, in the form of taxes and loans, no less a sum than 3,000 millions of dollars to support the government. These are wonderful results, and for them we have been largely, yet not wholly, indebted to the readoption of the protective system. That alone was capable of doing much, but we should have failed in the prosecution of the war had not the Treasury, by the establishment of a general medium of circulation, given us what has proved to be a great clearinghouse, to which were brought labor and all of labor's products to be exchanged. Increased rapidity of circulation was a necessary consequence of this, and to that increase, the greatly improved health of the societary body has been wholly due. Such having been the results of the two great measures by which the first period of Mr. Lincoln's administration had been distinguished, it might have been believed that neither one of them would be abandoned without at least a full and fair inquiry into the probable consequences of any changes that might be suggested. Those who might have so thought could scarcely, however, have reflected upon the general character of our legislation. No people, as it has been said, so soon forget yesterday. None take so little thought of tomorrow. No one looks back to study the cause of the good or evil that exists, and it is as a consequence of this that we have so constantly relapsed into British free trade, almost at the first moment that protection had brought about a cure of the evils of which it had been the cause. The most serious move in the retrograde direction is that one we find in the determination to prohibit the further issue of that circulation to which we have been so much indebted. Why is it made? Because journalists fancy that it is to paper money they must attribute the fact that paper is so high. Because men who depend on fixed incomes fancy that they should live better were the gold standard once again adopted. Because every free trader in the land charges the high price of gold to the use of greenbacks, and sees therein the cause why he cannot, with profit to himself, fill our markets with British cloth and British iron. Entirely in keeping with this are statements coming from the West of the great distress of government contractors, compelled to forced sales of the vouchers in their hands, of the great rise in the general rate of interest, and the extremely sluggish state of the society's circulation. The government has made itself responsible for the financial movement of the country. And when it stops payment, there is stoppage everywhere. Why has it stopped? Because those in the control of public journals fail to see that the cause of the high price of paper and of gold cannot be found in the circulation. Because the government itself fails to see that the circulation now furnished bears a smaller proportion to the needs of the people and to the extent of country requiring to be supplied than did that which was furnished when gold could be bought at an advance of 10, 12, or 15%. because all who write or speak on this subject fail to see that with the extension of the power of the Union over the cotton states, there must arise an absolute necessity for furnishing to the people of those states machinery of circulation adequate to the performance of the same work that has so well been done in these northern states. Far from diminishing the supply of that machinery, there is a pressing necessity for its increase. So he's arguing not just to keep the greenback, but we need to issue more because of all this new economic growth that's going to happen in the southern states with the end of slavery. We obtain a demand amounting to $168 million that must be met before we can purchase a piece of cloth or a ton of iron. Where is all this gold to come from? Tax the people is the answer. Give us an income tax of 25%. Tax sales, tax manufacturers. All this is being done, and so thoroughly that important branches of manufacture are likely to be taxed entirely out of existence. Paying his taxes in paper and obtaining cash for his products, the ironmaster can scarcely even today make head against those wealthy capitalists of England who have already placed themselves on such a footing as regards freight and duty that it is they who under a gold system will be protected and not their American competitors. So too with paper, the domestic taxes on which are 10%, while foreign paper is likely to be admitted at 3%. So too, I understand it is with leather. It is of high importance that proper checks be forthwith instituted, and now, for the first time in our history, it is in the power of Congress to let us have them. To that end, let us have a law declaring, first, that no bank shall hereafter so extend its investments as to hold any form other than those of gold, silver, or U.S. notes or notes of national banks more than twice its capital. Second, that in the case of already existing banks whose investments are outside of the limits above described, any extension thereof beyond the amount at which they stood on the first of the present month shall be followed by instant forfeiture of its charter. The whole South now requires reorganization, and one of the first steps in that direction should be found in furnishing machinery of circulation. And as much in need of this stands the whole of that great West, for the development of whose wonderful powers we are now exporting in that direction so many hundreds of thousands of our people. If the government does not supply that machinery, who is there that can or will do so? Look carefully, I pray you, my dear sir, at the vast field that is to be occupied and the great work that is to be done. And then wonder with me that the government should permit its soldiers to perish in the field while it is debating the terms of a loan to be made to it by men, all of whose interests are to be promoted by a diminution of the circulation and an increase in the rate of interest. Let our soldiers be paid. Let the credit of the government be once again reestablished. Let the rate of interest be kept down, and let the treasury reassert its independence, and all will yet go well. Having thus as paymaster reestablished its credit, let it next place itself in a creditable position as regards those who had been led to see in the moral tariff a pledge of protection against those wealthy capitalists whose fortunes count by millions, and who use those millions as instruments of warfare, by means of which they are enabled to overwhelm all foreign competition and to gain and keep possession of foreign markets. Let it restore those great fundamental branches of industry which constitute the pillars of our national temple to the position in which they stood in 1861, increasing the duties on foreign products by just so much as the taxes since imposed on domestic ones. And the result will then exhibit itself in the fact that sugar, tea, coffee, soda ash, and other raw materials of food and manufacture will twice over make amends for any loss that may be experienced by the revenue because of the substitution of domestic cloth or iron for that now made in foreign furnaces or on foreign looms. Let these things be done, and we shall then cease to look abroad for purchases of our bonds. Let this be done, and we shall soon find ourselves on the road towards becoming purchasers of those now held abroad, every one of which should be redeemed before we ever again place ourselves in a position to be required to furnish gold and silver in payment of our notes. Whenever the day shall arrive when we shall have so become, then and not till then shall we have placed ourselves in a position successfully to contend for the control of the commerce of the world, and thus to outdo England without fighting her. That control will find its place among the hands and heads of the community that makes and uses the largest quantity of iron. A single decade of the system above described would suffice for placing us in this respect side by side with England. At the close of another, she would be left far behind, and we should then have vindicated our claim to that position in the world of which our people so often talk, and of the true means of obtaining which they so little think. So that's a good summary of Henry Carey's position that he is taking, as opposed to somebody like Simon Newcomb, who we're going to look at now in his critical examination of our financial policy during the Southern Rebellion. Simon Newcomb was a mathematician. He hated Henry Carey. He got into economics because he was handed a Henry Carey book and thought it was completely unscientific nonsense because it was based on principles of political economy and was not wholly rooted in mathematics. He's one of the earliest examples of these mathematical economists that argue that, you know, the free market is perfect and price discovery is perfect, and there's just formulas that govern everything in the economy. He got his start reading Isaac Newton's Principia, and he was supported by a large Boston Brahmin class through the Boston Social Science Association. So Simon Newcomb says in his attack on the economic policy of the Lincoln administration, so with the measures under consideration, their real evil lay not in the inception of a fact, but in the establishment of a principle. It was not that we declared paper a legal tender, but that we adopted a rule of action under the operation of which public credit was but an empty sound. The fact that the measure was accepted by the country as a just and proper one made the matter worse, because the sanction of public opinion was thus given to a ruinous principle. And the principle was, for this reason, more likely to become a standard policy. So people liked the greenback. That's what made it so terrible, that it was so popular, and it was given this sanction of the general population. On the other hand, the more unfavorable the light in which the public view the measure, the more they reprobate the principles involved in it, and the less they are disposed to justify them or accept them as the basis of a permanent policy, the better. The general complacence with which our mercantile community look upon the failure of a house to make good its obligations, the frequency of such failures, and the circumstance that they are not looked upon as compromising the honor of the defaulters in any degree whatever, have been thrown into our faces by our transatlantic brethren as indicative of our very lax notions of public morality. So across the ocean in Europe, they're looking down on us. It's terrible, guys. We need to restore our honor in the eyes of England and France. Whatever metaphysical themes may be propounded about the demonetization of gold and its conversion into an article of merchandise, the following three facts are thoroughly understood by the mercantile community. 1, gold and silver have for centuries been the standard of value in every civilized country. 2, Gold is now the standard of value in our own, as in every other civilized country, in spite of the legal tender paper. And three, gold will be the standard of value in this and every other civilized country, in spite of anything any government may do to prevent it. It's just an iron law of nature and of economics. Gold is money, and there is no other type of money that could possibly exist. Our own country will now have to be accepted from the list of those in which it is always desirable to invest coin in savings banks rather than bury it underground. It is plain that while gold has been rising from par to a premium of 130%, the creditor class of the community, represented by the owners of bank stock, depositors in savings banks, holders of bonds and mortgages, and the frugal poor who have loaned their savings, have, on the whole, been subjected to heavy and unjust losses. While the debtor class, represented by those who live beyond their income or do business on borrowed capital, have made heavy and illegitimate profits. The debtor class, having been from time to time relieved of a percentage of their equitable liability, have found less difficulty than usual in meeting their obligations. Hence, there have been fewer failures than common, as well as larger profits, an unusual business prosperity, or the country is naturally considered prosperous when there are few failures and large profits. The corresponding losses of the creditor are productive of little inconvenience to him and are almost entirely overlooked. The writer has no disposition to hide the good or exaggerate the evil of the measures under consideration. He has shown that the legal tender notes, or rather their depreciation, has promoted commercial prosperity and the general enjoyment of wealth by the community. The government will gain by being enabled to buy and borrow on better terms than before. The real prosperity of the country will not be diminished, but rather increased, because we will then turn our attention to saving rather than enjoying our wealth. Indeed, if every dollar of our paper circulation were annihilated tomorrow, it would be a very serious question whether it were not the best thing for the nation that could happen. Whether we would not come out of the commercial crash, which would be the result, a wiser people, in a better position to fulfill our mission to the human race. The fact that our finances are in a far worse condition, and we as a people morally weaker than if we had never issued a government note, is of itself a sufficient answer to the question of whether the notes were necessary. We have seen that the legal tender notes have been productive of a vast amount of evil which does not yet appear, while there is absolutely nothing to place to their credit. There is but one way to set our credit on a firm basis, and we owe it to posterity to retrieve our faults by adopting this plan. It is to adopt a constitutional amendment to this effect. Nothing shall be a legal tender in payment of debts exceeding $10 except gold coin, tendered in the amount of at least 231 grains of pure gold to every $10 of indebtedness. Until this or something equivalent is done, public confidence can never be fully restored. So that is the Simon Newcomb, in a nutshell, argument against paper money. You can see he was just ideologically opposed to anything except gold. And now we'll come to, I think, the bigger betrayal of Hugh McCulloch, who was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, a former banker. Before he was first the comptroller of the currency, and then after Salmon P. Chase left, he appointed Hugh McCulloch to be Secretary of the Treasury. So Lincoln dies, and Hugh McCulloch becomes one of the most visible, if not the most visible, opponent of Lincoln's greenback policy, of paper currency, of an immediate return to gold specie as the only legitimate money in the United States. So he gives a ton of different speeches on this topic, but one of the most famous was in his hometown of Fort Wayne, Indiana, in October 1865. And first, I just gave this quote because it's kind of funny to people who know history. He's now working under President Johnson, Abraham Lincoln's vice president, who became president after he was assassinated. He's almost uniformly regarded as the worst, or at least top three worst U.S. presidents in history. And so here he's saying, don't worry. I work with Johnson. Not a few have been deeply anxious lest Mr. Johnson might be unequal to the prodigious work that has been devolved upon him. I feel constrained to say that there is, in my judgment, no ground for apprehension on this subject. Trying and difficult as is his situation, Mr. Johnson is a master of it. He possesses in an eminent degree the qualities that fit him for the presidency at the present time. A Southern man, thoroughly acquainted with the effects of slavery upon society, he knows how to deal with Southern men in their present circumstances. Ardently attached to Tennessee, the love which he bears to his state is entirely subordinate to that which he bears to the Union. Jealous of states' rights, he is equally jealous of the rights of the general government. A radical and uncompromising opponent of nullification, secession, and every form of disloyalty, he is equally opposed to any measures which, in his judgment, are calculated, by depriving the states of their just rights under the Constitution, to convert the federal government into a despotism. Raised in slave states, and until recently a slaveholder, he has never had any love for slavery, and has always been the antagonist of the aristocracy that was based upon it. By nature and by education, he is just the man for the great work of reestablishing the federal authority over the recently rebellious states. And he has taken hold of this work with a devotion, an energy, and jurisprudence that promise the best results. I accepted the office of the Secretary of the Treasury with great distrust of my ability to meet the public expectation, but with a sincere desire to so conduct the affairs of this great department as to aid in restoring the credit of the government, which had been damaged by the greatness of the public debt and the uncertainty in regard to the duration, if not to the result of the war, and in bringing up the obligations of the government to the specie standard. I am not one of those who seem disposed to repudiate coin as a measure of value and to make a secured paper currency the standard. On the contrary, I belong to that class of persons who, regarding an exclusive metallic currency as an impracticable thing upon an enterprising and commercial people, nevertheless look upon an irredeemable currency as an evil, which circumstances may for a time render a necessity, but which is never to be sustained as a policy. By common consent of the nations, gold and silver are the only true measure of value. They are the necessary regulators of trade. I have myself no more doubt that these metals were prepared by the Almighty for this very purpose than I have that iron and coal were prepared for the purposes in which they are being used. I favor a well-secured convertible paper currency. No other can to any extent be a proper substitute for coin. Of course, it is not expected that there shall be $1 in coin in reserve for every dollar of paper in circulation. This is not necessary. For all ordinary home transactions, a paper currency is sufficient, but there are constantly occurring periods when balances between countries and in the United States between its different sections must be settled by coin. These balances are insignificant in amount in comparison with the transactions out of which they arise. And when a vicious system of credits does not too long postpone settlements, they are arranged without disturbing movements of coin. Whenever specie is needed for such a purpose or for any other purpose, the paper currency of the country should be convertible into it, and a circulation which is not so convertible, will not be and ought not to be long tolerated by the people. So this is like exactly what Henry Carey was talking about in his letters to Schuyler Colfax, that the people of the United States have such a short memory that they get all these benefits after they repudiate free trade and go to protection, that they immediately then want to go back to free trade. They constantly relapse into it. And that what he was saying about the worthlessness of the gold promises of the paper as soon as there's any run on the banks whatsoever, that they're now going back to it again and saying, let's have, paper currency that's redeemable in gold. But of course, it's not going to be one to one. There's going to be extra paper that's issued in excess of what gold there is. But don't worry, because anytime you need the gold, it'll be there, right? The present inconvertible currency of the United States was a necessity of the war. But now that the war has ceased and the government ought not to be longer a borrower, this currency should be brought up to the specie standard. And I see no way of doing this but by withdrawing a portion of it from circulation. I have no faith, sir, in a prosperity which is the effect of a depreciated currency, nor can I see any safe path for us now to tread, but that which leads to a specie payment. The extreme high prices which now prevail in the United States are an unerring indication that the business of the country is in an unhealthy condition. We are measuring values by a false standard. We have a circulating medium altogether larger than is needed for legitimate business. The excess is used in speculations. The United States are today the best market in the world for foreigners to sell in and among the poorest to buy in. The consequence is that Europe is selling us more than she buys of us, including our securities, which ought not to go abroad. And there is a debt rolling up against us that must be settled in part, at least with coin. The longer the inflation continues, the more difficult it will be for us to get back to the solid ground of specie payments, to which we must return sooner or later. If Congress shall early in the approaching session authorize the funding of legal tenders, and the work of reduction is commenced and carried on resolutely, but carefully and prudently, we shall reach it probably without serious embarrassment to legitimate business. If not, we shall have a brief period of hollow and seductive prosperity, resulting in widespread bankruptcy and disaster. Ironically, as soon as this contraction starts, that's exactly what we see in the 1865 to 1868 period. Widespread bankruptcy and disaster from exactly what McCulloch is advocating here, contraction of the paper money supply. By the experiences of the past 4 years, we are led to the conclusion that our people have a latent power that always manifests itself when required and is equal to any emergency. I have faith, sir, that as we have, to the astonishment of the world, raised immense armies, larger, I apprehend, than any single nation ever brought into the field, and met with the enormous expenses of the war without borrowing from other nations, we shall also be able, without a financial crisis, to fund our surplus currency and interest-bearing notes, bring back the business to a specie standard, and place the credit of the country on the most stable and satisfactory basis. If we do this, we shall accomplish what the soundest thinkers in Europe have considered an impossibility, and what no other people but the free and enterprising people of the United States, occupying the grandest country in the world, could accomplish. But should we be disappointed in these hopeful expectations, should no early check be put upon the issues of paper money, should prices still further advance and speculation be still further stimulated, and the result thereof be extensive bankruptcy, depression, and hard times, the grand destiny of this country and this government will not be affected. The United States occupy the best portion of the temperate zone of a continent, stretching out their arms to Europe on one side and Asia on the other, and producing all articles necessary for the subsistence and comfort of the race. If cotton be king, he is, thank God, enthroned again in the United States. If bread be king, where should his capital be but in this great valley of the Mississippi? This nation has within itself everything that is needed to make it the greatest among the family of nations. Coal and iron in juxtaposition, an inexhaustible supply. Mountains and valleys rich enough in gold and silver to furnish the world for all time what may be needed for circulation and other uses. Copper and lead and other minerals in no less abundance. A soil of wonderful fertility, a climate salubrious and diversified, and above all, republican institutions and an energetic and again united people. So, in response to this, and this will be the last one for today, Henry Carey issues directly to Hugh McCulloch letters in this 1866 pamphlet, Contraction or Expansion, Repudiation or Resumption. And it was largely due to this speech. Like I said, Hugh McCulloch gave many speeches, but that one in particular got widespread attention. So he calls them, I think there's 7 letters. He calls them like letter first, letter second, letter third, that sort of thing. So in the first letter, he argues that actually the expansion of the paper money supply is not a problem, and actually it has a lot of room to be expanded further. And he compares the US money supply to Britain and to France and does his calculation and finds that per capita, there's about $25 per capita circulating in Britain and $30 per capita circulating in France. But in the US right now, there's only $12.50 circulating per capita. And he also argues that the entire massive war effort, we built all this infrastructure that we needed. It was all done with the greenback only, not with gold or silver. How did we do that if paper money cannot work at all? So then in the letter second, he gives a review of the situation in 1861, people out of work, debtors unable to pay back loans, businesses unable to expand, being forced to close. This was all due to a lack of money, and the national treasury was wholly empty, thanks to President Buchanan. And now he says, I'm quoting, why was all this? Why did they not use the gold of which California had already sent us so many hundreds of millions? Because, I already read this quote, actually. I guess I doubled this up. Or maybe he said it twice. Maybe he said it to Skylar Colfax as well. I'll have to go check that out. But he says, we had followed the train of British free trade, and the teachers who had assured us, our people, that the safe, true, and certain road towards wealth and power was to be found in the direction of sending wheat, flour, corn, pork, and wool to England in their rudest form, and then buying them back again at quadruple prices and paying the difference in the products of Californian mines. So now he's giving this argument of, let's imagine this extremely rich person. Okay, he says, such having been the case of things on the day to which I have referred, let us now look at the remedy then required. And let us for a moment suppose the existence of an individual with wealth so great that all who knew him might have entire confidence in the performance of what he promised. And let us then suppose he should have said to the laborers of the country, go into the mills, and I will see that your wages are paid. To the millers, employ these people, and I will see that your cloth is sold. To the farmers, give your food to the laborer and your wool to the millers, and I will see that your bills are at once discharged to the shopkeepers. Deliver your coffee and your sugar to the farmer, and I will see that payment shall forthwith be made. To the city traders, fill the orders of the village shopkeeper, and send your bills to me for payment. To the landlords, lease your houses and look to me for the rents. To all, I have opened a clearinghouse for the whole country and have done so with a view to enable every man to find on the instant a cash demand for his labor and its products. And my whole fortune has been pledged for the performance of my engagements. And then let us examine into the effects. At once, the societary circulation would have been restored. Labor would have come into demand. thus doubling at once the productive power of the country. Food would have been demanded, and the farmer would have been enabled to improve his machinery of cultivation. Cloth would have been sold, and the spinner would have added to the number of his spindles. Coal and iron would have found increased demand, and mines and furnaces would have grown in the numbers and in size. Houses becoming more productive, new ones would have been built. The paralysis would have passed away. Life, activity, and energy having taken its place, and all these wonderful effects having resulted from the simple pledge of the one sufficient man that he would see the contracts carried out. He had pledged his credit and nothing more. What is here supposed is almost precisely what was then done by the national treasury, the only difference having been that while in the one case the farmers and laborers had been required to report themselves to the single individual or his agents, the government has since, by the actual purchase of labor and its products, and the grant of its pledges in a variety of shapes and forms, enabled each and every man in the country to arrange his business in the manner that to himself has seemed most advantageous. In this manner it is that domestic commerce has been stimulated into life, the result exhibiting itself in the facts that while we have in the last 5 years increased to an extent never known before the number of our houses and our mills, our mines and furnaces, our supplies of food, cloth, and iron, and while we have diversified our industry to an extent that is absolutely marvelous, we have been enabled to lend or pay to the government thousands of millions of dollars, where before, under the system which made us wholly dependent on the mercy of the wealthy capitalists of England, we found it difficult to furnish even tens of millions. The whole history of the world has presented no case of a financial success so perfect. And I really like this analogy that Henry Carey gives between the human body and the societary body, because he's always saying that the rapidity of circulation for money is what is most important for the health of the economy. And he also says in the analogy, in the physical body, health is always the accompaniment of rapid circulation, and disease is that of a languid one. So when your blood circulation slows down, you got problems. And in the economy, when the circulation of money slows down, you got problems. And a healthy circulation is what is needed in both. I really like that analogy. And he gave a speech in 1857 called Money, on the topic of money. And he's echoing the same arguments in this letter to Secretary McCulloch. He's saying that the power of accumulation exists in the ratio of the rapidity of circulation. And it does so because the greater the rapidity, the more complete is the economy of human force. The greater the production and the more complete the economy of interest. That power may grow a full supply of the medium of circulation is as much required as is a proper supply of railroad cars and engines. Without these latter, there would be few exchanges between the East and the West, the North and the South. And without the former, it is wholly impossible that there should be that rapidity in the exchange of human service to which alone we must look if we would have increase of production and of societary force. At no period has the power of accumulation been much more than half as great as it has been shown to be in the years of the Great War that has now so happily terminated. For all of these successful results, we stand indebted to the combined action of two great measures of the administration. First, the adoption of a national free trade system. And what he means by that is internally to the country, free trade between all sectors of the economy, and trying to encourage protection from without, while encouraging the development of infrastructure which allows for trade within the country, by aid of which producers and consumers were to be brought to act together. And second, the adoption of a national system of circulation based entirely on the credit of the government with the people, and not liable to interference from abroad. Both were needed, and neither one could, without the other, have been productive of the great results that have been achieved. To the latter of them, however, you object, on the ground that it has caused an unnatural and injurious rise in prices, that it has lessened the disposition to exertion, and that it tends now to cause great diminution in the productive industry of the community. To all this, I answer that when carefully examined, the facts do not seem to me to sustain these objections, and that such is certainly the case, I propose in my next to show. So now in the letter third, in an introduction, he's showing, he gives a list of prices that have all gone up from 1860 to 1865. And some of them, he says, the prices going up had nothing to do with the greenback. For example, beef, the price has gone up because there is a cattle plague in Europe and a huge shortage in cattle. But he does show that in general, prices are inflated from within that period. He says, leaving wholly out of view, with the single exception of a cattle plague occurring simultaneously with the diminution of our own supply of cattle, all of the circumstances above referred to would there in the prices current now be found as great a change for the better as we should have been warranted in expecting from the creation of that great internal commerce which had resulted from the adoption in 1861 of a policy having for its object the bringing together of the producer and the consumer to the great advantage of both. Must not any attempt at further forcing down prices with a view to compelling export of our products in exchange for gold be followed by inability to pay the taxes and by financial and political ruin? Do not all the facts above given show clearly that what we really need is such a stimulation of the society circulation as would cause that increased demand for all the products of the farm, which would maintain their prices and diminish the necessity for employing our people in that which is the proper work of the barbarian and the slave, and of them alone, to wit, that of raising raw products for the supply of distant markets. Throughout the period of Mr. Lincoln's administration, that circulation was active to an extent never before known in any country of the world, and to that activity, as has been shown, have we been indebted for power successfully to prosecute the war. How we have been indebted to increase in the supply of the medium of circulation for promoting that activity, and thus enabling us to supply the thousands of millions rendered necessary by the war, has been also shown. What have been the precise facts connected with the change of prices above exhibited, I propose in my next to show, and have now to ask for them your careful consideration. Meanwhile, my dear sir, permit me here to say a word or two in regard to my own position. Throughout the war, I have been a heavy sufferer under the legal tender system, having been, as I still am, compelled to accept paper in the place of gold that honestly was due me, and to pay double or treble price for almost everything I required to purchase. My apparent interests are therefore all on the side of an early return to specie as the standard. But well do I know that my real interests are so closely bound up with those of my neighbors that what must be bad for them cannot be good for me. And in the letter fourth, he gives a timeline of the money supply for the Lincoln administration. So at the close of 1860, we had paper money in 150 million and a total with the specie circulating about $250 million. By the summer of 1861, there was a contraction of the money supply due to the Southern Rebellion, and there was a general hoarding of money due to the insecurity of the situation. By the summer of 1862, the money supply went up to $400 million due to the issuance of the greenbacks. However, during this period, the prices only went up about 25%. So nowhere near in ratio to the increase of the money supply. And a lot of this inflation was due to beef and pork, which were needed to feed the armies. So there was a massive new demand for beef and pork as food to feed the soldiers, that the government um, created this huge new demand for beef and pork, which caused the price to go up. December 1863, total circulation is again up to 690 million. So we have a massive inflation, almost 3 times as much money circulating from 1860, but we see price inflation was only 50%. And again, roughly 2/3 of the price increase is in beef and pork prices. 1864, the total went to 750 million, but now it is circulating among many millions more people because of more states being under union control. But now the prices skyrocket 68% over 1863. So you had a slight increase in the money supply, but a massive increase in the number of people using that money. So the percentage per capita goes way down, but you have a massive skyrocketing of prices in just 1 year. Why is that? The real cause of all this extraordinary rise, in the face of a diminution in the proportion borne by circulation to the need for it, is found in the following paragraph of the Comptroller of the Currency. By a gold valuation of our imports and exports, the balance that has accrued against this country during the 4 years previous to the 30th day of June last, including the interest on American securities held abroad purchased within that time, and also taking into due consideration the difference between our own standard and that of foreign gold, which is 9 3/8%, has been $308 million. This of itself would be sufficient to account for all the rise of gold and the rise of paper money prices that occurred in 1864. And yet, thereto must now be added a sum almost, if not even quite as large, for covering the expenditures of our travelers in Europe, the interest on stocks and bonds held in Europe before the war, the freights and the undervaluations of our imports. It is safe, as I believe, to estimate our expenditures abroad as having exceeded our exports to the annual extent of 150 million, or in the whole, 600 million. The only commodity in which this balance could be paid was gold, the price of which naturally rose until it had so thoroughly emptied all the hoards of the country, public and private, that scarcely any now remains, except what is indispensably necessary for the payment of interest by and of duties to the government. It fell with the opening of southern ports and the emancipation of cotton, and with it fell too the prices of each and all of the commodities in the list above presented. Is there, however, to be found any evidence that the plethora of paper money had controlled the prices of our various products? None whatsoever. On the contrary, the changes are precisely such as must, under similar circumstances of supply and demand, have occurred had the idea of a legal tender note had no existence. The total difference between the sum of the prices of 1860 and 1865 is $35.90, of which 3/4 even are here found in the articles of pork and beef, leaving but $9.40 for all the other. Hay for paper money is cheaper than when it was payable in gold. Wheat now commands far more gold than it did in 1864. Why? Because the crop proved short. Butter remains high because cows have become far less numerous. Oats are scarcely higher than they were 5 years since. And corn has fallen to half the price of 1864 because the crop has been very large. That paper money is democratic in its tendencies may readily be seen by all who study the fact that it is scarcely at all used by the great operators in foreign merchandise of whom you have spoken, or by the stock board operators to whom you yourself, my dear sir, have referred. Thousands of millions pass and repass among such people without the aid of a single note, whereas among the small operators of our cities, the workmen of our factories, the laborers in our fields, the farmers and miners in the West, There exists an absolute necessity for a letter of credit in the form of a bank or a treasury note to be used on the occasion of each and every exchange of commodities or services that is made. A war upon what is called paper money is therefore a war upon the poor in favor of the rich. And that the war being made upon it has precisely that effect is proved by the fact that the Western farmer is now being impoverished by reason of such a reduction in the price of corn and oats that the former is being used as fuel, and while the latter is being sold at 8 cents per bushel. Houses and lots in the neighborhood of Wall Street, commanding at this moment prices such had never before been heard of. That such a war can have no end other than that of political revolution, the most complete, is so absolutely certain that, regarding as I do the future of the country and that of the administration as being inseparably linked together, I feel it a matter of positive duty most respectfully to ask that you should once again examine this question with a view to satisfying yourself that at no time in our history has there existed any such plethora of paper money as that which you speak, and that the supply of the medium of circulation is not only not in excess, but is at this moment so far below the real needs of our people that any attempt at further reduction must be attended with financial and political dangers of the most serious kind. And he was exactly right about this. This is exactly what was seen when they did contract the money supply. In his letter fifth, he writes, so precisely is it as we pass from our great and populous cities towards those regions of the West in which states are being formed, whose total population scarcely exceeds that of single wards of Philadelphia or New York, the societary movement becoming at each and every step less and less rapid, and the necessity for a material representative of value more and more urgent, until at length we reach those regions in which, to the present hour, no bank has yet been tolerated, no greenback used for purposes of circulation, and perhaps no contract made that could be otherwise redeemed than by actual delivery of the precious metals. As a consequence of this, it is that while cheapening gold throughout the world, the price there paid for the use of machinery of circulation is higher than in any other community of the world claiming to rank as civilized. The societary movement of the distant West is therefore, in this respect, nearly on par with that of the lowest and least productive portion of our city population. Credit, circulation, and the substitution of mental for muscular power, traveling always hand in hand together, and thus producing increase of societary force. The substitution of circulating notes for coins constitutes an important step in the progress of civilization. And yet a further and more important one would still remain, to wit, that of so elevating the whole population of a country as to enable the little people, those who work, to do as do those great ones who profit of their labors, performing all their exchanges without the aid of any material representative of the money to be paid. That, of course, could never be accomplished, and the idea is here suggested merely with a view to calling you attention to the fact that it is in that direction which lies the road towards real civilization. Sufficient it will be for us if we shall take the first great step of bringing up our whole people, the near and the distant, the inhabitants of Atlantic cities and Western territories, to a full comprehension of the advantage to be derived from the steady and regular use of the letter of credit known to the world as the greenback, or that other one known as the national banknote. At times, the feeling of a necessity for this has produced an effort in that direction, as when in 1835, the paper circulation had reached $100 million, and again in 1856 had attained to double this amount, to be, however, in both cases followed by collapse and ruin. Why was this? Because of an excess of circulating notes? Assuredly not, for with a widely scattered population, whose need for a tangible representative of money was then thrice greater than that of the European manufacturing nations, the actual amount in use was not even 1/3 as great per head as that we see to be required in both France and England. The real cause of the fearful changes to which you have referred is found in this: that while requiring our people to regard the precious metals as the basis of all their contracts, we had overlooked the one great fact that those metals travel always from semi-barbarous countries to those which are civilized, from those in which the rude products of the earth are cheap to those in which they are dear, from those whose people, like our own, are employed in selling their soil in the forms of corn and cotton, to those which bring from abroad rude products and thus enable themselves to create a real agriculture, and from those in which labor is performed by the unassisted human arm, to those in which coal and iron ore are so utilized as to give to each and every individual the service of willing slaves who do the work, meaning like machinery using coal and iron, which are the willing slaves, requiring in return neither meat nor drink, neither clothes nor shelter from the weather. The raising of raw products for distant markets is the proper work of barbarous communities, and none such has ever yet nor ever will maintain a specie circulation. The collapses came in 1837 and in 1857, and with what effect? Who were they that then most severely suffered? Was it not the people of the West, from whose midst the circulating note so wholly disappeared, driving them back to that barter system from which they but then had made an effort to escape? And who profited? Was it not the wealthy of our cities, in whose hands then centered nearly all the circulating medium of the country? Assuredly was it so. And thus were the rich of the East made richer, while the poor of the West were made poorer than they had been before. With the opening of rebellion, there came, throughout almost the entire West, a third collapse, and with precisely the same results: ruin to the man who was in debt, and an increase of wealth to the already wealthy owner of New York and Boston lots and houses. Now again has there been made a great effort towards enabling our Western friends to accomplish that great step on the road towards civilization, which consists in substituting letters of credit for material money. Such a result, my dear sir, might have been expected to bring with it an almost universal conviction that we had at last stumbled upon the real road to progress, that in a great deficiency of the machinery of circulation had been found the essential cause of many of the most serious difficulties of the past, that it would be desirable to proceed onward in the same direction, stimulating production and gradually placing our people in a position to accumulate such a store of the precious metals as would enable each and every man to determine whether to content himself with individual promises, such as, in the great marts of commerce, have now so entirely superseded the circulating note, to demand the note, or still further, to insist upon the delivery of the coin itself. Such is the point at which we should desire to arrive, such the one at which we should arrive, could our people but be persuaded once to see that the substitution for coin of the circulating note is one of the evidences of advancing civilization, that its convertibility into coin is dependent on the maintenance of a system that shall cause the inward current of the precious metals to exceed the outward one, and that to attempt resumption in the face of a system that not only makes demand for all the produce of California mines, but year after year adds hundreds of millions to our foreign debt, is a course of action that must result in financial revulsion, to be followed by political revolution, the most complete. Journalists, however, my dear sir, tell us that circulating notes cause speculation, that speculation causes men to travel about when they should be in the field or workshop, that if we would stop this speculation, we must rid ourselves of the plethora of paper money under which we are supposed to suffer, and that the way towards financial and political salvation is to be found in sending abroad bonds with which to purchase such supplies of the precious metals as will enable each and every man to determine for himself the sort of money in which he will be paid. What kind of speculators? He speculates as to whether he can be best employed in mining coal, making cloth, smelting iron ore, sinking shafts, building mills, erecting furnaces, making roads, or buying treasury bonds. These things he does only after carefully speculating as to the direction in which he is to look for the largest return to his labor or his capital, or both. He is speculating for a rise, as is every employer of capital, every really useful man amongst us. He desires that money may be abundant and that the charge for its use may be small. With that class of speculators, farmers, laborers, mechanics, manufacturers, road makers, and others, the national treasury has been allied throughout the past few years. And from that alliance has come the power successfully to prosecute the great war that has just now closed. To those speculators stand we now indebted for the facts that our railroad facilities are twice greater than they were 5 years since, that our furnaces are capable of producing more than 1.2 million tons of iron, and our rolling mills annually 750,000 tons of bars, that houses have grown in number in full accordance with the growth of population, that oil wells have been developed, capable of supplying the home demand and giving us annually 30 million gallons for export, that the supply of food has grown from less than 1,000 millions of bushels to more than 1,200 millions, that the supply of wool has grown to more than 100 million. Woolen mills have meanwhile grown to such an extent as still to need from abroad large supplies, and that in almost every department of manufacture we have made, in the midst of an expensive war, a progress such as is without a parallel in the whole history of the world. There is, however, another class of men who, while building no houses, making no roads, opening no mines, erecting no furnaces, stand always ready to purchase them at the sheriff's hands. These men, being speculators for a fall, desire that money be scarce and interest high. And with them it is that the treasury, wholly unintentionally on your part, as I am very certain, is now allied. So which speculators is the treasury going to be allied with? Scarcity of money presses into the market the 730s, men who helped the government in the day of its need, now finding themselves compelled to sell at heavy loss, thereby aiding in building up the fortunes of those throughout the war have speculated for a fall and have witnessed with regret the triumph of loyalty over treason that has been secured. Step by step, with every movement in this direction, the societary movement becomes more sluggish, with steady increase in the number of men who seek employment and cannot find it. Cheap money, low interest, enabled our working men to prosper, built up that party, carried us through the war, and gave us our present position before the world. That dear money, high rates of interest, will swamp both the party and the country. In his letter 6th, he writes, "The farmer and the laborer ask why prices are so high and their income is going down. They are told speculators built too many factories and planted too many acres, and the country, now expecting a return to specie, expects a major economic downturn and price deflation. Told that he and his neighbors have become speculators, and the way to salvation for the country lies through such a war upon this paper money as will have the effect of compelling his neighbors and himself to sell their food and their wool at prices to be fixed by other speculators in Chicago or Cincinnati, representatives of great capitalists of New York or Liverpool, who have not only withheld from the government all aid, but have given their best efforts for accomplishing the dissolution of that union in whose behalf he has made such heavy contributions. At all of this, the wealthy capitalist rejoices, receiving 10 or 12%, where before he had only 5 or 6, and buying at heavy discounts the bonds of those who had helped the government when its existence had been most endangered. The wealthy manufacturer goes on his way rejoicing in the idea that the danger of increased domestic competition has passed away. The receiver of fixed income rejoices in the idea that the decline in the price of gold now enables him to live abroad and profit by the lower rents and lower prices of continental Europe. The British manufacturer rejoices in the knowledge that he is from day to day becoming more and more master of the situation and more enabled to dictate the prices at which he will buy and those at which he will sell. The Copperhead, meaning northern supporters of the South, knowing well that to an activity of circulation without parallel in the history of mankind, the government has been indebted for power to make the war, now rejoices in the gradual spread of a paralysis in that in every stage of its progress is more and more preparing taxpayers to seek a change of rulers. Throughout the war, as has been shown, the National Treasury had for its allies the men who worked, those who sought to rise, those to whom it was desirable that money should be cheap. And to that alliance, we have been indebted for all our past success. Now the alliance is with those who do not work, those who, having risen, have money to lend, those who desire that food and labor may be cheap and money dear. To the former, we have stood indebted for power successfully to make a war unparalleled in its demands for blood and treasure, and for the existence of a faith in our future such had never before been witnessed in any country of the world. To the latter stand we now indebted for the facts that faith in the future is gradually passing away. The burden of taxation is becoming more and more severe, and that preparation is now being daily made for a financial and political revolution that must result in causing us to forfeit all the advantages that in the brief period of Mr. Lincoln's administration and at the cost of so many thousand millions had been acquired. And in his last letter, he says, France 30 years ago had about $3,000 per square mile of land area circulating, and now has about $5,000. England has about $5,000 to $6,000. So we see an expansion of the money supply for the given square mile. Each successive stage of the increase has been accompanied by a growth of foreign commerce fully corresponding with that observed in France. Such being the facts, to what extent do they correspond with the teachings of the learned men who, following blindly in the steps of Hume, so confidently assure us that every increase in the quantity of money used tends to render a country worse as one in which to buy, though better as one in which to sell? Do they not, on the contrary, prove directly the reverse of this? Do they not show clearly that every increase of power to command the use of machinery of circulation is attendant with improvement in the condition of the country, both as sellers and buyers? That such is the case can no more be questioned than can the existence of the facts that light invariably follows the rising of the sun, and absence of light his disappearance. Nevertheless, all our practice, as it is proposed now to show, has been in direct accordance with the teachings of the learned Thebans, who have thus far failed, and yet do fail, to recognize the existence of the great principle that the power of accumulation exists in the ratio of the rapidity of circulation. The Treasury finds itself now reduced to look to foreign bankers for the help so greatly needed. Of all the financial blunders ever made, it stands now forth as one of the worst. Why it should have been made was that Congress then had, as few of our people have even now, no proper appreciation of the fact that of all the commercial nations of the world, our own is the one that is worst supplied with the machinery of circulation, that machinery for the use of which men are accustomed to pay interest. The more abundant the machinery of transport, the greater will be the quantity of goods transported, and the less the charge for transportation, to the great advantage of producer and consumer, and to the great benefit of the governing power. The more perfect the supply of the machinery of exchange, the more prompt and numerous will the exchanges be, and the lower the rate of interest, to the great advantage of both public and private revenues. At the present moment, this latter is greatly short, and hence the existence of a paralysis by means of which we are, as it is asserted, to reach resumption. To me, however, it appears to be the road by which most speedily to attain the point of a disgraceful and wholly unnecessary repudiation. And so this is his conclusion letter, which he writes: influential Republican journals, by many supposed to represent the views of the administration, are proving daily to the men of intelligence and enterprise, those speculators who have created the mills, furnaces, and mines to which we have stood indebted for power to make the war, that not only must they no longer rely upon the cooperation of the national authorities, but that they may count securely upon their opposition or oppression. Crippling those who had commenced the creation of new mills and furnaces, they have already closed many of those that had been throughout the war at work, and are now most effectually preventing the undertaking of any new enterprises tending towards development of our mineral wealth or towards increase of our industrial forces. Therefore is it that we are largely and rapidly diminishing the demand for human service and lessening the power of the laborer, the mechanic, and the miner to claim reward for labor. This too being done at the very time when thousands and tens of thousands of able-bodied men have been and are being discharged from the public service. The very time too when active and earnest men are engaged in an effort to draw from Europe the supplies of men required for enabling us to develop our vast resources. That while reducing the prices of food and labor, we are largely and rapidly raising the general rate of interest, thereby enabling those who do not work to profit at the cost of those who do. That we are making taxation more and more burdensome while lowering the rate of exchange to the great advantage of those who prefer to expend their incomes abroad rather than do the same at home. That we are thus daily making it more impossible that our mills and furnaces should supply the domestic market, that those who live at ease should apply their means to the advantage of those who labor, that ships should be built to enter into competition with those of Europe, that we should in time of peace extend or even maintain that independence to which we have been indebted for recent success in war. As consequences of all this, we are supporting abroad at an annual estimated cost of $100 million, 100,000 of our people engaged in consuming foreign food and paying for foreign labor, enabling foreigners to deluge our markets with cloth and iron, in the production of which have been consumed hundreds of millions of bushels of foreign food, increasing in every manner that can be devised the demand for the capital and the skill of Europe, while destroying demand for the wonderful mechanical skill of people at home, raising the prices of all the things we need to buy, money included, while lowering those of all the things we need to sell, stocks and bonds not accepted, exporting every ounce of gold yielded by California, increasing daily the necessity for going abroad to beg for loans, and thus adding to foreign debt that now already exceeds $1,000 million, selling abroad at little more than half price bonds that must in full prices be redeemed in gold, paying thereon on the security of the whole property of the Union a rate of interest unknown to any really civilized people of the world, more than thrice the rate at this instant paid by the British government, with whom we should now be contending for control of the commerce of the world. Compounding interest by borrowing the money with which to pay it, and thereby doubling its amount in less than half a dozen years. Such being our present course of operation, it may not be proper here to ask the questions: why is it that such things should now be done? Why is it that we have so entirely abandoned the policy that carried us so triumphantly through the war? Seeking a reply thereto, we find it in the fact that our eyes are closed to the existence of a very simple principle whose perfect truth has recently been so fully demonstrated as to make it absolutely marvelous that it should now be doubted. That principle being embraced in the following words, to wit: the power of accumulation exists in the ratio of the rapidity of the societary circulation. Throughout the war, that circulation steadily increased in its rapidity. And for the reason that a really national free trade policy created demand for labor and its products, a really national system of circulation, meantime, giving to the internal commerce facilities of exchange, such never before been known. Since the peace, however, we have been traveling backward and undoing all that had been so well done. The question, my dear sir, now before you for determination is, in my belief, the most momentous one ever yet submitted through the decision of a single individual. We have just now closed a little internal difficulty, leaving yet for settlement the one great question as to whether the world is, in all the future, to be subjected to that British and anti-national system which has for its special object that of enabling bankers and brokers to enslave the farmers and laborers of the outside world, or whether the Union shall now place itself in the lead of the now agricultural nations for resistance to that system and for relief of the agriculturalists of the world from the oppressions under which they have so long suffered. Contraction, by means of which the price of money is being so rapidly carried up, looks in the first of these directions and must result in giving the victory to England. Expansion, by means of which there shall be reestablished the alliance between the treasury and the employers of money, farmers, laborers, artisans, and the speculators, look in the second, and will give the victory to us. Health, wealth, strength, and the power of accumulation growing always with growth in the rapidity of the societary circulation. And as a PS, he adds, already an apprehension is beginning to prevail in some business circles that a crash induced by natural causes cannot be much longer postponed. And in any event, it is obvious that should Congress authorize a policy of contraction by the national treasury, a speedy check must be given to the present reckless extravagance of prices. The reckless extravagance here exhibited is, as we are assured, to be checked by a policy of contraction. In opposition to this, however, we have the fact that it follows a contraction that has been for months in progress, one so serious that it has now reduced the paper money circulation to an amount actually less per head than is the coin alone of Great Britain, leaving wholly out of view the hundreds of millions of her paper money and the thousands of millions of credit money, by means of which she is enabled to transact countless millions of business without the need of either coin or notes. Such being the case, may it not, my dear sir, be possible that the reckless extravagance here referred to comes as the natural consequence of a contraction that has largely raised the rate of interest throughout the country, that has greatly diminished general confidence, that has caused the present paralysis, and that threatens destruction of the internal commerce, and that the real remedy is to be found in the pursuit of a course of measures tending to the restoration of confidence, such as I have already indicated. So I will leave it there as the first of Henry Carey's big forays into the fight to maintain what he calls the societary circulation of the greenback. And am I still sharing my screen? Something just
No, I the screen sharing is over.
Okay, I'll just show here quickly, Matt, just because I have some future leads to show everybody a little taste of part 2 and possibly part 3. So we have William Kelly, who was from Philadelphia, and he was really Henry Carey's biggest ally in Congress. He gives a number of speeches, the protection to American labor. He gives a speech, Contraction, the Road to Bankruptcy, Not to Resumption. We also have Henry Carey Baird, who was Henry Carey's nephew, and he also takes up the mantle of his uncle's legacy while he's alive and also after Henry Carey dies. And he writes a number of pamphlets. He does a study of what happened in England when they resumed specie payments as a warning to the people of the United States. He writes letters on the crisis, the currency, and the credit system in 1873. He writes Money and Its Substitutes. So there's a lot of leads here for further investigation. He writes so Henry Carey also, this is a publication by Henry Carey after the commissioner of the Board of Revenue, David Wells, put out a very famous report. This was Henry Carey's response. So to dive into this, there's also this memoir that I found by William Elder of Henry Carey and his remembrances of this entire period, with a lot in it. But here's just one quote from it where he says, he, meaning Henry Carey, insists upon making our national currency non-exportable in order to escape the disturbances produced by the actions of other countries. If we adopt gold, for instance, in common with them as the standard in domestic exchanges, it does not follow from his doctrine of value that our coined money should be bimetallic, and that silver, without regard to the cost of its production, may be forced into equivalence with gold at any fixed proportion in weight. His object is to make our currency independent of foreign standards. He says, with a sound national system, let foreigners take our gold for whatever balance of trade they can impose on us, having no use among ourselves for any coin money except what we can retain under a wholesome foreign commerce. What we need most today, he further says, is the establishment of that monetary independence which results from maintaining absolute command over the machinery of exchange used within our borders, leaving to the gold dollar the performance of its duty of arranging for the settlements of balances throughout the world. As I understand him, his publications upon this subject, made in the last year of his life, have their true explanation in the principles here quoted from earlier works, and all that he has written in support of the greenback currency and the remonetization of silver has this bearing and aim, and no other. There's also this big reception that was given for Henry Carey, the dinner at the Labrier House in 1859, where a bunch of people gave speeches I'd really like to dive into as well. I want to dive into Justin Morrill because he is thought of as this great ally of Henry Carey and the Morrill tariff, the first tariff of Abraham Lincoln. So he's thought of as being on their side, but he's actually an enemy of Henry Carey in this fight. He's very much for the gold standard. So we can see even within these protectionist circles, disagreement on this. And I'd really like to look into the correspondence between Henry Carey and Justin Morrill. I did find this one here as a taste, where Henry Carey writes to him and he says, "Dear sir, the Treasury bill just now reported needs an amendment of its title to the following effect: an act to provide for county, public, and private bankruptcy, for repudiation of the public debt, both local and national, and for restoration to power of the copperheads of both North and South. Congress made last winter a great mistake in obeying Mr. Ferguson's advice. In now obeying that of Mr. McCulloch, it is making a very much greater one, as you will be satisfied when it shall have become too late. For heaven's sake, pause and reflect upon the real causes of the difficulties of which the Secretary complains. He does not see them. The whole future of the country and of the Republican Party is dependent on what you do with the bill that you have now reported." And so Justin Morrill, he takes over from Thaddeus Stevens as the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, which is like the most influential committee in terms of determining what gets approved, where money gets spent and allocated. And so in this period from 65 to 69, Justin Morrill is hugely consequential in the restoration of the gold species standard and everything that happens. So he definitely needs further investigation. This was a speech he gave in the House, 1867, an exclusively paper currency inconsistent with permanent prosperity. And Thaddeus Stevens, that biography that I read from, I only read the intro. I really want to dive more into the part of the book that deals with this period, because Thaddeus Stevens he was also from Philadelphia, Thaddeus Stevens, and he becomes a great ally as well of Henry Carey, fighting for the greenback. He had tried to deliver the government from bondage to the gold standard during the war, and he believed that if gold was ever to be restored to its former money use, it would be not by the policy of contracting and destroying the beneficent currency which the war had produced, but by the growth of the country, by its expanding trade, and by the retention and larger legal use of this paper currency, all of which would serve to bring the greenbacks to a parity with gold. Thus, gold, silver, and the war paper would all circulate together. As usual, he spoke forth boldly his principles and his sympathies. When the issue, as he would put it, between the money of the people and the money of the gold dealers came up in a new form, Stevens committed himself instinctively to what he considered the cause of the people, to the cause of the poor, of the struggling masses. On the other side, the forced resumption of gold payments and dear money he looked upon as the cause of the rich, the powerful, of the pampered classes that were seeking special favors from government. He opposed Secretary McCulloch's policy of steady and rapid contraction. He resisted the forced and rapid resumption of specie payments, and all the wrath and indignation of his nature were roused to oppose and denounce the policy of turning all the obligations of the government into long-time gold bonds, and of repudiating the lawful money of the country as a means of debt payment. So this is only a tiny little sliver of that section, which I've started to get into. There'll be a lot more on Thaddeus Stevens. But to end here, just a list of some of the people that were on both sides of this fight, besides the ones that we've looked at. Freeman Clark, Comptroller of Currencies. These are all this people, the gold bugs who were on the side of resumption and contraction of the paper money supply. George S. Coe, who was a Wall Street banker. John Austin Stevens, president of the Bank of Commerce. Senator John Sherman, Representative James Garfield, Senator William Fessenden, Senator Roscoe Conkling, Representative Robert Schenck, E.L. Godkin, editor of The Nation magazine, William Cullen Bryant, editor of the New York Evening Post, Manton Marble, editor of the New York World, Edward Atkinson, leading Boston Brahmin cotton manufacturer, David Ames Wells, the author of that Wells report I mentioned previously that Henry Carey issued a refutation to, Henry Adams and Charles Francis Adams, both gold bugs, and Jay Cooke, ally of Abraham Lincoln. So we see how this issue is complicated and traverses both sides of the Republican Party. And lastly, other allies of Henry Carey in this fight, Representative John Griswold, Senator Benjamin Wade, Senator Oliver Morton, Representative George Julian, Representative Benjamin Butler, Representative Green Rom, Representative Samuel Sunset Cox, Representative John Logan, Peter Cooper, an industrialist, Stephen Colwell, an industrialist, Eber B. Ward, a Michigan steel and shipping magnate, William H. Silvis, labor. So these were like labor organizers, William H. Silvis, Andrew Cameron, Alexander Campbell, and Brick Pomeroy, editor of the La Crosse Democrat. So a ton of leads. That's why I said, Matt, I don't even know if it'll just be a part 2, maybe even a part 3. There's just so much work I have yet to dive into.
No, clearly, man. I mean, it's you're scratching on some incredible leads here. And I noticed that you brought up Garfield again, and it just shows you that you can't really approach this stuff with a simplistic binary frame of mind, because Garfield was certainly stepping on the toes of very powerful, very, very dangerous forces, but at the same time was confused, I guess is the best way to say it, right? But how would you characterize Garfield and his inability to understand the power of the greenbacks and the nature of the battle?
Yeah, I obviously am a bit biased because I am on the side of Henry Carey and Thaddeus Stevens, and I think that we now in the modern age have the benefit of hindsight, and that we have now had an unsecured currency. We don't even use paper anymore. Most of us just use digital money now. So there's this notion that, like, and Henry Carey in certain parts of what I quoted there really gets into it, that like money is just a representative of value. It's not the value itself. The real value is in production. And that's the big error that I see when you go and read, for example, um, not so much Hugh McCulloch, but the other one, Simon Newcomb, where he's saying only gold and silver are true measures of value. And it's like they're not the true measures of value at all. The true measure of value is production. They're merely like an abstraction layer on top of it that we use to enable what Henry Carey calls the rapidity of circulation. That the increase in the rapidity of circulation is beneficial for society. So anything can be money, you know, like there's the famous example of the tally sticks in England, literally just sticks of wood that were an incredibly successful money supply in medieval England. Um, that's not what value is, but I think that it's this kind of sophistry that many bought into, and it was kind of a tradition as well in America. I mean, Alexander Hamilton had gold money, he had silver money, he had copper money, and he had paper money. So there was like this long tradition in America that gold and silver were part of the money supply. And I think that there was a fair amount of brainwashing which came over from British, um, British thinkers, that it became the British really pushed, that gold is the only legitimate form of money. And that's why even like later on, we're going to get into what they call the crime of 73 when they demonetized silver. Because America had these vast amounts of silver that were coming out of the West. And they shot themselves in the foot saying you can't use it as money. You can't make your own coins and coin silver anymore. And there was a huge, one of the worst economic downturns in the history of America that came for like 20 years after that. So, yeah, I think a lot of it is combined with that. But you're right. I mean, it's interesting to see Roscoe Conkling and James Garfield on the same side. Because as we know, Guteau, when he shot Garfield, yelled out, "I am a stalwart," meaning of Conkling's faction. And now Chester A. Arthur is president, celebrating the fact. So it's some interesting nuance there that I really want to dig into more.
Absolutely. Monty, I know you had a thought. Do you want to toss it out there?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's 1973 that Nixon took us off the gold reserve standard, but I agree with you there that the value is in our production, and that can be denominated in different ways. I mean, you can have a basket of various resources of your country, but would you comment on the difference between a gold or species act standard as opposed to what was a gold reserve standard, which I think was designed, the gold reserve standard, just for internal use to at least balance how much money and the basis for it based on the price of gold, but it wouldn't be like a species act. It couldn't be just given up as far as exporting other countries taking gold for our money. So could you just comment on the difference between the gold standard and the gold reserve standard?
Yeah, of the Bretton Woods system, you're saying, right? Of like post World War II that Nixon ended. It was in 71 that he closed the gold
Right.
window.
Okay, right.
So it's very similar to what Henry Carey is describing in some of the stuff I quoted earlier, that you still retain gold for settling of trade accounts between countries. So a country might not necessarily accept your paper currency. So if you had the difference of trade between imports and exports between each country be settled in gold. And that was exactly what the Bretton Woods system was as well. That was the gold aspect of the gold window at the Federal Reserve and under the Bretton Woods system. And what happened was that, as so often occurs in war, that they were printing a ton of money to fund the Vietnam War in the 60s. And England and France were like, well, we see this currency being depreciated. We want the gold. And so they kept coming and saying, like, redeem this for gold, redeem this for gold. And eventually Nixon said, we can't keep printing money like this and you know keep redeeming all these notes for gold. So we're closing the gold window. And that is, the weakness of paper currency, that it can be printed into oblivion, that it needs to be done with proper care and management to its issuance, that you can't just keep issuing it forever. Eventually you will dilute it into nothing, but that there is a certain amount, whether you measure it per capita, as Henry Carey does some places, or per square kilometer and other places, that there is a certain amount of money, whether it's gold or gold certificates or pure paper money or whatever, that is necessary for the economy. And the problem is that a lot of the gold people, they see, is so often the case in poorly done economics, they see it as a static closed system, that there's just a set amount of money, and that if you expand the money supply, you're just going to dilute the currency. But you can also sometimes need to expand the money supply. And Henry Carey makes this point several times that I showed, that your economy is growing, that you're adding new industries. You have new discoveries, which are enabling new industries to be created that never existed before. Look at aviation, just as one example. What was the value of aluminum in 1850 versus 1920, right? And all of these scientific discoveries that enabled aluminum manufacture. The top of the Washington Monument was capped with aluminum because at the time aluminum was worth more than gold. It was so rare. But the scientific discovery that allowed for mass production of aluminum made it such that now we use it like for tinfoil. So the expansion of the paper currency sometimes is also necessary because it's not a static system. It's not a closed system. It's a dynamic system. A human economy is based on ideas and scientific discoveries that enable us to create entirely new forms of economy that never even existed before. Now we're talking about creating mining on the moon, or moon bases, and eventually setting up a launch pad from the moon and going out and mining in space. I mean, where's that going to be in 100 years from now? It's in its nascent form now, but it's just one example of new creations, new scientific innovations that enable entirely new forms of economy, and that then requires more money for it to be in existence.
Yeah, it just occurred to me, rather than something static like gold or silver or whatever, as far as the expansion of the money supply, one measure of that to me could be what the concept Lyndon LaRouche came with insofar as potential relative population density. In other words, the measure on which we can sustain a human population, which could expand because we increase our productive powers of labor, our science and technology. So just a thought.
No, I completely agree with you. The potential relative population density, which I got into in another talk I did with Rising Tide, it was called Vernadsky and the Directionality of Progress. That's exactly right, and it's one of the reasons why LaRouche was such a big supporter of Lincoln and Henry Carey and all that. I saw, I think it was RB made a joke about LOL mining on the moon, and I would just caution against saying things like that because Simon Newcomb is very famous. The pro gold specie guy that I talked about earlier. One of his famous blunders was saying that powered human flight will never occur. It's scientifically impossible. And then the Wright brothers, did it. I think it was like 5 years later from whenever he said it. the advances in robotics and everything that we're making, we will be mining in space. It might be 20 years from now, it might be 100 years from now, but it might not be humans mining, but we will be mining in space one day, and we will have nuclear fusion one day. And it all seems like a fantasy until somebody makes the discovery.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Well, I mean, it's important to think about. I guess this is the mind matter, relationship, which has been at the heart of the human experience for thousands of years. Is how do they relate to each other? This metaphysical aspect of ourselves that is immaterial, but that shapes the material world, and then how do we think about how those work together? Um, so I think that the optimistic idea that Lincoln and Henry C. Carey and all of the Vernadsky that you've spoken so much about, they're always looking at the question of potential as if it's a real thing, but that we have to earn to, like, we have to to really live up to actualizing that potential that is within us to make those discoveries, to go outside of our limits, and to enforce the money supply and whatever type of system we allow to exist in circulation to serve that mandate and not the inverse, which is, I think, the pattern that I've noticed in all of your lectures and all of your work as far as I've known you, which is a great lesson for today's very confused world that doesn't really have a clear idea of what is value, what is human nature, what is the purpose of law or of monetary policy. I got a question for you on actually, first, before my question, Richard asked me to read out his question, and it's basically just can you compare the greenback system that you went through today with the modern monetary theory expounded since the 70s by a variety of people? But yeah, could you compare that? Where is the modern monetary theory? Where does it approximate the greenbacks? Where does it deviate? What's your assessment?
I'm not an expert on modern monetary theory, so I don't know. From what I understand, a lot of them are fans of the greenback. So they look to the greenback as a positive feature of American history. Um, yeah, I don't know enough about modern monetary theory to make a competent comparison between the two. Um, I don't know the people that are behind pushing monetary MMT, or what their interests are, what their beliefs are. I don't know if there's any like Malthusian aspect to it. I would say that in general, people who recognize that the monetary supply doesn't need to be based on gold or silver, that money is just a representative of value, and the actual value is in production of the physical economy. Those people tend to be anti-Malthusian, and that I would hope that the MMT crowd are as well. I don't really know. I think her name is Stephanie Kelton is one. I think I saw a documentary on it years ago, who's one of the main people. And yeah, a lot of what she was saying, it seemed interesting that it's not necessarily the issuance of money that is bad, but I don't understand it well enough to fully comment on why or make an apt comparison between the two. Maybe that could be a future talk. Actually, is a real study and compare and contrast the two. Yeah, so that's all I can really say about MMT at this time comfortably, because I just don't have the expertise in what MMT really is. Um, but I would ask, like, am I right? Like, do you see parallels between the two? Like, what do you see as differences between the two, if there are any?
Well, I read a book on MM. It was all about MMT, and it just was making the point that the government can spend into existence, just like greenbacks. And the question is the balance between the rate of economic exchange and the money supply that determines the value. So it seemed pretty similar to me. That's all.
Yeah, that's again, I don't have a great understanding of it, but what I understood is that what they're saying is that it's not necessarily bad for government to just print money.
All right.
And that
Spend it into existence. I mean, that what
suspended
that said in the greenbacks is the way they issue greenbacks is by buying services or buying products for government, and that put it into circulation.
Yeah, and they had these bonds, well, at least the first ones. They had these bonds that the first greenbacks were redeemable for those bonds as well. So as long as people had faith in the government bonds, then they would have faith in the greenback. And then later on, the national banking system, the national banks. So the national banks were like state banks, which converted to becoming national banks under the National Banking Act. So they had to line up with these regulations. And then once they could show like we are compliant, then they could call themselves, First National Bank in New York or Second National Bank of Boston, whatever it is. And they had to buy the US bonds as backing for the national banking notes that they issued. So it's tough, because the government's issuing these bonds. Like, what are the bonds backed by? The full faith and credit of the United States, right? And what is the full faith and credit of the United States? It's what the country produces. It's the output of the country itself. So that's the real value of any money, right? It's not that it's backed by gold in a warehouse somewhere.
How is that different from like in a time of economic crisis, Keynes said that the job of the government is to spend the money and make the jobs, and it'll increase the consumption and it'll like make the wheels of energy or the wheels of industry start moving again. And how is this modern monetary theory? Where does it differ from Keynesianism? Is it just that it lacks the type of constraints Keynes has when it comes to the overarching boundary conditions of how much money should be issued in a time of crisis, or how?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Keynes said that in a crisis, you could bury money in the ground and then pay people to dig it up, and that would be economic activity. So to me, that's just like a completely fundamental misunderstanding of economic value. And I don't even like to address Keynes because I don't believe he understood what value actually is in making a statement like that.
Yeah.
Like in that way, you could justify issuing money to buy anything.
Right.
Like you could set up a credit policy to build brothels or to, I mean, any kind of like non-productive element. I mean, you could, and we do now. That's one of the problems in our society now is look at the 2008 collapse. And they just issued a flood of money to speculators on Wall Street to keep buying options and derivatives. And, it was completely unproductive. But it appears like, oh, we're making a profit. Look, we're creating value, right? We're not actually producing anything. We're just pushing paper back and forth. But we're losing money here. We're making money here. Overall, we're providing value to society. That's the big lie, I think, that the value is in real physical production. And that's what we've lost. That our society has become one which was industrial, and now, it's based on finance and real estate speculation. Those are all the biggest companies, the FIRE economy, right? Finance, insurance, and real estate.
Mm-hmm. Have you encountered the school, not to deviate too much from the core thrust of your presentation, but on this topic of modern month, like alternative theories that look a little bit like the American system but aren't, that seem to have their own lineage, that don't seem to that's the weirdest thing that I find about. I agree that a lot of the supporters of MMT tend to be very sympathetic to Hamilton and the American system when you talk to them, but when you read the writings of the people that they like, there's absolutely no acknowledgement of this, or very little at least, of this American system school from Hamilton onward. It's like it almost doesn't exist, and it's like they've got their own lineage, which doesn't seem to play a role into this battle that I've and you've been mapping out historically. But then there's this other school that also dovetails into this called the Georgist school, the Georgists. Have you looked at them and their land money theory and all of that, and how that plays in or doesn't into this whole story?
Um, I don't have an opinion on Henry George. I've learned a little bit of him. I know that his book that he wrote was at the time like the most popular book. It sold like millions of copies. It was apparently the inspiration for The Wizard of Oz, the book. The Wizard of Oz, like OZ, right? The ounces on the yellow brick road, meaning gold. And in the original book, Dorothy is wearing silver slippers, not ruby slippers, like in the movie. So that whole allegory is like lost in the movie. And the Wizard of Oz, like the man behind the curtain, that it's really all just a house of cards that comes down, collapses as soon as you pull back the curtain. There's all this allegory in Wizard of Oz that, from what I understand, was largely influenced by Henry George. I don't know enough about Henry George. I looked into him deeply enough to, make a judgment call on the on this ideology of, where I stand on it. Do I think he was, a good guy or not? I don't know enough about him. So
Okay.
that could be a future line of inquiry, though, to do
All right,
a little series
got
on
one
Henry
last one.
George.
That's cool. Yeah, mental note. All right, got one last one that I think is a good one to end with. Arby is asking, popular question. Wasn't Hamilton an agent of the Rothschild banksters? So maybe you could just address that for the last question of the day.
Actually, it's funny because the very first time I met you, Matt,
Mm.
2009,
Yeah.
you had a table outside that conference,
Right.
and
Yeah,
I said the exact
Davos in
same
Americas.
thing. I said the exact same thing to you because you were pushing Hamilton on me, and I was Money
Right.
Masters guy. I'd seen Money Masters like 16 times, and I was like, Hamilton, he was a Rothschild agent, right? Because that's in the movie. It's really funny, that movie, actually, because he's so anti-Hamilton and then he's so pro-Lincoln and has absolutely no idea that there's like a direct line from Hamilton to Henry Clay to Abraham Lincoln and his policies. That Abraham Lincoln, in effect, brought back the third national banking system of the United States after Hamilton's first Bank of the United States, and then the second bank that was set up after the War of 1812. No, Hamilton was killed by the actual Rothschild agent, Aaron Burr, who was the actual parasitical, speculative finance prototypical archetype in the United States, who was given money to set up his New York water service with a tiny clause that said, if you have any money left over at the end, you can use it for banking. And then built such a poor water system in the United States just to do it all as cheaply as possible, so he'd have as much money as possible left over to start his bank, that he literally caused like cholera outbreaks in New York City because of the water quality in his water distribution system. And I think it's a wonderful metaphor, actually, with the killing of Alexander Hamilton by Aaron Burr, because you have this war between the parasitical speculative class and the industrialist productive class represented by Hamilton. And I mean, you see this again and again in the writings that I just showed today of Henry Carey, that tradition living on from Hamilton to Henry Carey, of like these bankers who don't work parasitizing the people that do work, in society and the ones who actually create value.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the I also watched the Money Masters several times as part of my own waking up process. And yeah, that thing really went viral before the term viral was a thing in the 90s, and it confused so many people by just fusing together so many truths with so many fallacies in a way that it takes a while to sort of like unpeel and like carve out the wheat from the chaff. But
Yeah, and
yeah,
there's a lot of fake quotes in that movie too, which Bill Still, the creator of that movie, later admitted, at least to his credit. He was like, there was this quote that I loved so much turned out to be fake.
yeah.
And yeah, no, there was a lot of fake stuff in that first movie.
Arby's
And it's
asking,
funny, he
where
made
did the
another.
smear of him being a Rothschild
I don't
stooge? Where did that?
know. I don't know
Nor
where
I
that
think it
came
came.
from.
I think it came from the Andrew Jackson uh movement. Like while Andrew Jackson was alive, I think they were already maybe it existed before that. In I don't know if that was in Hamilton's lifetime where it was already being thrown out there. Though I didn't see that. I didn't see any evidence of that. But it might have been during because Andrew Jackson was really positioning himself as the emblem of freedom, right, against the banks. He just
Yeah,
devoted
but
his entire.
he was managed by Martin Van Buren, like chief, Wall Street banker Martin Van Buren, and later uh, uh, not disciple, but he is like the mentor of August Belmont, like the actual Rothschild agent in America. August Belmont, funder of the Democratic Party under Lincoln, like huge nemesis of Lincoln, big supporter of the Confederacy, all of these things. Yeah, I mean, we know, right? This party were the people against Lincoln, that the British were supporting the Confederacy. This is all basic historical fact by now. The British were cheering on the what they believed was the imminent destruction of the Union. They didn't believe the Union would survive, and they were cheering it on in their internal um, diplomatic correspondence.
Yeah.
And we know Aaron Burr's succession plot, literally writing to the British saying, "Please give me help in breaking up this country." You know, so we know what an agent he was. We know the family that he married into.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
and if you
So,
don't, go and read Anton Chaikin's Treason in America. It will be highly enlightening. Great section on Aaron Burr,
mm-hmm.
and on all this too.
Absolutely. Well, Sam, thank you very much for introducing this very challenging but very rewarding set of ideas and research that you've been on. And we'll try to make. When I put this up online, I'll try to make as many of the source documents that you were using today available for people to click on and study on their own. That it's definitely we're out of practice in our current culture of reading a lot of source material, especially from the 19th century when the language was sometimes a little bit more challenging. But it's a really important muscle to flex. So like I said, I'll go out of my way to do that. I know we have whole dossiers on the Rising Tide Foundation site of Henry C. Carey's works. A lot of his smaller essays and larger books are available in digital form, so I'll make those available. As well as a link to your Substack, Overcoming Oligarchy, which I encourage people to subscribe to. We've got a podcast as well, which is fun. So thank you, Sam. We'll organize the follow-up lectures in the days ahead. We'll figure something out for a date that works for you in maybe August or something, or sooner if you'd like. And yeah, thank you everybody for sharing for today's Sunday afternoon presentation. And next week what we have is Marty, who will go through, I forget what, but it's Martin Seif, so it's going to be fun. All right. Hi, everybody.